What's going on, guys? This is Junior here, and today I'm going to show you how to build a full stack application with ReactJS in the front end and Spring Boot on the back end. And before we begin, I'm just going to give you a quick demo of the application that we're going to be building in this course. And the application is a contact list, as you can see here, so like a contact manager. And when you first come to the application, you're presented with the list of all of your contacts. So you can see here, I have 11, and you can see they are all here in this card. I can also click on one of these cards to see a detailed page of the contacts. So for example, if I click on Messi here, you can see I have Messi, and then I can update the information. I can also update the photo. So for example, if I update the email, so I'm going to say Lionel, and I'm going to remove the Messi. So I'm going to delete that, and then I'm going to click save, and you can see it's been updated. And I can also change the image. Well, if I go back, you can already see that it's now Lionel. So let's go back and fix that. So Messi. And you can see as I'm typing, it's also updating in the UI. So we're going to say Messi and then save. So it's been saved, and we can go back. Now you can see it says Lionel Messi. If I want to change the image, for example, if I go to Neymar and I'm going to change the photo, then I'm going to pick LeBron, and you can see the image was changed to LeBron, even though we're looking at Neymar. And I can go back to the list. You can see now Neymar has a LeBron image. So let's go ahead and change that back. So let's go to Neymar. Select, and I'm going to choose Neymar. Okay, so now we have Neymar back. So let's go back. So you see that we can go to a specific contact, and then we can update the information. We can also add a new one. So for example, I'm going to click here, and I'm going to add Pele. This is going to Pele at gmail.com. And I'm just going to make up some random number. And then I'm going to say Brazil. And I'm going to say inactive. You guys know why I put inactive here. And then I'm going to choose a photo. So let's go to my downloads, and then I'm going to pick this picture of him, and I'm going to click save. You can see now we have an additional contact, and you can see Pele was added here. And now if I go to Pele, you can see now we have Pele, and then I'm going to update him. I'm just going to give him a last name, Nascimento, I think it is. And I'm going to save. Okay, so it's been saved, and I can go back. You can see now it says Pele Nascimento. So I can add a new contact, I can update an existing contact. I can also see all the contacts. You can see now we have 12, and we can also delete a contact, but that's the assignment for the course. So the deletion is going to be what your assignment is going to be. There's one last feature in the application that I want to show. So that's the pagination. You can see now we have a full screen full of contacts. And if I add a new one, then it's going to create a new page. Then we're going to have more than one pages. So for example, if I click on add a new one, and then I'm going to add Rick, let's say Rick Sanchez. And then I'm going to say Rick at gmail.com. I'm going to say scientist. And then we're going to make up a number. And then I'm going to say Seattle. And then we can say active. And then I'm going to select a picture of Rick because I already have one here. And then I'm going to say save. You can see now at the bottom, we have 2 pages. And I can click on 2. See now we have Wesley Snipes in the last page. And I can go to the previous page. You can see that's everyone in the previous page. And we have 13. We have 12 here. And then we have one more in the second page. So pagination, which is really cool, is something that I'm also going to show you how to do using Spring Boot in the back end, and we're going to be using React in the front end. So this is the application that we're going to be building in this course, and this course is designed for beginners. So if you're a beginner and you want to get started with Spring Boot in the back end and ReactJS in the front end, then this course is for you. I keep it very, very simple, while I also try to give you the best practice and clean code. But just know that this is going to be very beginner friendly because that's who this course is designed for. So the next thing that I'm going to do is to show you what you need to have installed so that you can follow along with the course. So that's what I'm going to show you next. So the first thing that you're going to need is Node.js. So as of right now, the latest version of Node.js is 2010. So make sure you just click on this button, and then it's going to just download the file, and then you can install it on your computer. So make sure you have Node.js because we're going to be using Node.js to build the ReactJS application. For the backend, you're going to need to have Java installed. So make sure you have Java installed on your computer because we're going to be creating a Spring Boot application. So you can just go to this website and then install Java on your computer. To save all of the information, we're going to be using PostgreSQL. So make sure you have PostgreSQL installed. I actually don't have PostgreSQL installed on my computer. I'm just using Docker. So I'm spinning up a Docker container, and that gives me an instance of the PostgreSQL server. But if you want, you can just install it on your computer. but I'll show you as well the Docker Compose file that I'm using to create an instance. So if you have Docker installed on your computer, you don't have to install this. You can just run a Docker container, and then once you're done, then you can just stop the container or delete the container. In any case, we're gonna need to have a place to store our data, and I'm choosing PostgreSQL, but if you want, you can use MySQL. The change you have to make in the backend application is very minimal if you are using a different type of relational database, but I'm gonna be using PostgreSQL. And then to access it, I'm gonna be using pgadmin. Again, I don't have pgadmin installed on my computer. I just have an instance and a Docker running, and then I can just access it. But if you already have it installed, that's good. If you're gonna use MySQL, then you can use Workbench. So it's really no big deal if you don't want to use Postgre or you don't want to use pgadmin, as long as you know what you're doing. And for my IDE, I'm gonna be using Visual Studio Code for the front end. So whenever I'm gonna be working on the ReactJS application, I'm going to be doing everything in Visual Studio Code. I don't even have to talk much about Visual Studio Code. Everybody knows about Visual Studio Code. So let's move on to the IntelliJ is what I'm going to be using for the backend. So for the Java application, which is going to be a Spring Boot Maven application. So I'm going to be using IntelliJ. You can just download it for free. Just use the community edition. You should be okay. So that's everything really you're going to need. So Node.js and then Java, and then some data store. In my case, I'm using PostgreSQL, a user interface to interact with the data store. So in this case, I'm using pgadmin, but you can use any other tools that you like. And then an IDE. So I'm using Visual Studio Code for the front end, and then IntelliJ for the backend for the Java code. So as long as you have all of these installed, then you should be good to go. And like I said, I will show you the Docker Compose file that I'm using for Postgre and pgadmin. So make sure you have this software installed, and then we're going to continue in the next lecture. Assuming you have everything installed and you're ready to go, I'm just gonna go ahead and close everything else, just leave one. And then here I'm gonna go to Spring Initializer, ZR, and then click on that first link. So what this is gonna allow us to do is to just create a Spring Boot application. And I'm gonna be using Maven, so I'm gonna click Maven here. I'm gonna be using the latest version of Spring Boot, so that's 3.15. And then I'm just gonna fill out the metadata information. So I'm gonna zoom in a little more and then fill this out. Okay, so I fill all of this out. So this is going to be up to you, whatever you want to put here. And my packaging is going to be a jar. We're not going to be deploying this, so that really doesn't matter. And then I'm going to use the latest version of Java, which is 21. So latest version of Spring Boot 3.15 as of right now, or as of the time that I'm recording this video. And then the latest version of Java, so that's 21. Now we need some dependencies. So I'm going to do Spring Web because we're creating a web application. Spring Data, JPA, also going to use Lombok. And then we need the SQL, Postgre, and that's everything that we're gonna need. So Spring Web, Spring Data, JPA, Lombok, and then the driver for PostgreSQL. If you wanna see what you're getting in the dependencies, you can just click on Explore, and it will show you what the application is gonna look like. You can even look at some of the file structure here. And if you're happy with what you're seeing, you can just close this and then you can click on generate. And that's just gonna create a zip file with the application. And I'm gonna do that and then open the application in IntelliJ, and then I'm gonna come back. So I have the application open in IntelliJ. I unzipped it and then I just open it in IntelliJ. And the first thing that I'm gonna do is to just rename that main application file. So you see here it says contact API application. I like to rename this to just application. So we're gonna rename this to application and then refactor, select all, refactor. Okay, so now if we go in here, we can see it says application. So the first thing that we're gonna need to do is to define the shape of the contact. So if we go back for 1 second and go back to our app. So we have this contact, we have to represent it in our backend application. So we know we're gonna have a name, a title, an email, an address, a phone number, and a status. So we need to be able to capture all of this information using a class so that we can create object off of that class, and then we can save those objects in a database. So let's go back to the application, and we're gonna create a new package for domain. So domain, and then I'm gonna create the contact. So we're gonna say class. This is gonna be the contact. So we're gonna name it contact. And then I'm gonna close this panel and close this tab. So now we're going to work on the contact. So we know that we're going to need to have an ID. So I'm going to say private string ID. So I'm using string to represent the ID, and I'm going to show you why. I'm not using a long or some kind of an integer or anything. So I'll explain the why in just a second. And then we're going to need a name. So private, that's also going to be a string. That's going to be the name. And then we're going to need the email. So private string email, and we're also gonna need the title, and we're gonna need the phone. So we have the phone, and we're also gonna need the address. And this is a string, and then we need the status. And then also they have an image, so we're gonna represent that as a photo URL. So the URL pointing to the image. So there's a couple of things that I wanna say about this. So for example, the address, if you are building a more complex application, you would probably want to represent the address in its own class. Okay, so you wouldn't set the address as a simple string. It would be better, or it would make more sense to represent the address as its own class. And also the status would probably be some kind of an enum instead of just a string. But again, this is designed for beginners, so we're keeping it real simple. And then here we want to pass in some annotation for JPA. So I want this to be an entity. So we're going to say entity from Java persistence, and I can pass in a name for the table. So I'm gonna say table, and then I'm gonna give it a name. So we're gonna say name, set that equal to contacts. And then since we have Lombok, I'm gonna give it some getters and setters. So I'm gonna say getter and then setter. Also gonna give it a no args constructor and also an all args constructor. And then I'm gonna add a JSON include, and that's going to be non-default. Non-default. So what this is gonna do, it's only gonna map to JSON what is not the default. So for example, if we have null for a particular string, because that's the default for a string, then whenever we're mapping the JSON over to the front end, it's not gonna pass this JSON because it's the default. I'm gonna add a static import for this. We also need to add ID on this, so that JPA knows this is gonna be the ID. And I'm gonna use a UUID for this, and that's why I set it as a string. So I'm gonna say add UUID generator. So every time we save a new contact, this is gonna be set as a UUID. And I also wanna put some column definitions. So I'm gonna say column, and I want this to have a name of ID. So name is going to be ID. And then I want it to be unique. So I'm gonna say unique true, and then updatable false. Okay, so that it cannot be updated and it has to be unique. So this is going to be served as a primary key, and it's going to be a UUID, or in the format of a UUID. So that's going to be our primary key in the database. So this is represented as an entity in JPA. I'm just going to move this to the bottom here. Makes more sense like that. Now what we have to do next is to create a repository that JPA can use to manage this class. And that's what we're going to be working on next. So I'm going to open the panel and close this, and then I'm going to right click on the main package, and I'm going to create another package. I'm just going to call it repo, and in here I'm going to create the contact repository. So we're going to say contact repo, and we want to annotate this with add repository. Not required, but I just like to see it here. But even if you don't have it, it will work anyway. And then I want to extend the JPA repository. So we're going to say JPA repository. And then we have to give it the class that we're managing with this repository. In this case, it's going to be the contact class. So coming from our domain, and the type of the primary key, in our case, it's a string. Okay, so the primary key that we defined here, its type is a string. So that's what we're passing in here, the string here. And also this is supposed to be an interface, not a class. And then there's just one method that I'm gonna have in here. So I'm gonna say it's gonna return an optional of contact, and I'm gonna call it find by ID, and it's gonna take the string, which is the ID. So we're gonna give it an ID, which is gonna be a string, and it's gonna try to find the user, which is gonna be an optional. So it's possible that we might not have a user by that ID. I'm gonna remove the space, and that's everything we have to do for the repository. And if you want more functionalities, you can add them in there, but I only need this one, so that's the only one that I'm adding. But if you wanna add more, like find by email, then you can follow the same pattern and then create another method like find by email and then pass in the email. I only need this one, so that's the only one that I'm gonna have in here. Next, we need to create a service so that we can use in the controller. So that's what we're gonna be working on next. So I'm gonna close these two tabs again, and then right click, create another package. That's gonna be the service package, and inside of it, I'm gonna create the contact service, and I need to pass in some annotation here. So the first one is going to be the add service, and if you want, you can also pass in you can pass in the log, so slf4j, and you can also pass in at transactional. And for at transactional, I'm just gonna make sure that I roll back whenever I have an exception. So I'm gonna say exception.class. And one last one that I need is the required args constructor, because we're going to be doing dependency injection here. So now let's bring in the repo. So I'm going to say final contact repo. I'm going to give it a name of contact repo. Let me collapse some of these. And what I want to do now is to define some of the methods that I'm going to need. So I'm going to go down and then I'm going to say public. This is going to return a page. So I'm going to say page, and it's going to be a page of contact. I'm going to say get all contact, for example. And it's going to take a page. So we're going to say page and the size. So we're passing in the size and the page, and it's going to give us a page of contact. So that's what this is going to do. And then here, what we want to do is to call the repository. So we're going to say return the contact repository that, and then we want to call find all. You can see it takes a pageable. We're going to pass in the page requests of, and then you can see we can pass in the page, the size, and we can also pass in a sort. So let's select the second one, and we're going to pass in the page, we're going to pass in the size, and for the sort, we can say sort by, and then we're going to pass in the name. So it's going to sort by name. So whenever we add a new contact and then we get all the contact by calling this method, it's going to sort everything by name for us. So in alphabetical order. So this is the get all contact, and I'm going to scroll down a little more. We need another one that's going to get one contact. So this is going to return one contact. We're going to say get contact, and then we have to pass in the ID, which is a string. And then here we just have to say return the contact repository that find by ID. So that's the method that we defined. So find by ID, we're going to pass in the ID. This is returning an optional, so we're going to say or else. We're going to throw, and then we can just say we're throwing a new runtime exception, and we can just say contact not found, because there's a possibility that we might not be able to find a contact using this ID. So if that's the case, then we're going to throw this exception. Otherwise, it's going to return the contact that he found. Then I'm going to scroll up, and we need another one to save a contact. So I'm going to say public. We're going to say create contact. We're going to take the contact object. So it's going to be a contact. And all we have to do is to just save it. So we're going to call the repository again. Well, we have to return and then save. We're going to pass in the contact. This is returning a contact. Okay, scroll up some more. Then we're going to have a delete. So I'll just copy this. I'm going to call it delete, return void, delete contact. It's going to take the ID or the contact. And then I'm going to say assignment. Okay, so this is for you to implement and to make it work in the entire application. And then I'm going to need one more to upload the picture. So the one to upload the picture is going to be like separate from all of these. And that's the one that I'm going to be working on next. So I'm going to scroll down some more, and then I'm going to create another one. So I'm going to say public, and it's going to return a string. So this string is going to be the photo of the user. And then I'm going to say upload photo. There's two things we need to create a new photo or to upload the photo for the user. The first one is the ID of the user, because we need to know who the picture is for. And then we're also going to need the multi-part file, which is going to be the actual file, like the physical file that we have to save on the computer. And then what we're going to do, let me see if I can put more space here so that I can scroll up. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to get the contact. So we're going to say contact, and then we're going to say equal get contact. We pass in the ID. So this is going to throw an exception if you can find the contact, or just give us the contact. Then I'm going to define another string, which is going to be the photo URL. Set it equal to, let's make it null for now. And then we want to set this, so set photo URL, and then we're going to pass in the photo URL. So we're setting the URL of the photo for the user on the user object. And then we want to call the repository and then save, pass the contact. The reason we're saving the contact is because we updated it. So we get it from the database on this line. We create a URL, which is going to be the photo URL. We set it on this contact, so the photo URL, and then we save that new information in the database. And then we can just return this URL because we need to return a string. Okay, so now we need to determine what this URL is going to be. So let's go down and let's create another private, because this is only going to be used in this class. And since we're using Java 21, so let's do some cool stuff here. So I'm going to create a by function, and this by function is going to take a string, it's going to take a multi-part file, and then it's going to return a string. There's a lot that I can say about what a function is doing, but technically we're defining a method, you can say, and it's going to take a string and a multi-part file, and it's going to return a string. So now I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to say maybe like photo function. So photo function, and then now we have to take these 3 parameters because we need to use them. So we're gonna say, well, the 2 parameters. So we're gonna say ID, and then it's gonna be the image for the second one. And then now we're gonna have our function. So an arrow function like that. So we're defining a function or a method that's gonna take a string, a multi-part file, and then it's gonna return a string. So that's what this entire thing is doing. And we're calling it photo function, and it takes the string, the first string, which is the ID, which we're going to pass from here, and then the image, which is the multi-part. Okay, so now we just have to work on this. Oops. Okay, so let's define a try catch block. So we're going to say try and then catch. We're going to catch any exception, and whenever there's an exception, we're just going to throw it. So we're going to say throw new runtime exception, unable to save image. Okay, now we can work on the actual saving of the image, and also we need an equal sign here. All right, so what we're going to do is, since we have the image, we're going to define a path. So we're going to say file storage location, where we're going to save the file. We're going to say path paths.get, and then we can pass in a directory, and then we're going to say that to absolute path that normalize. So what this is going to do is it's going to give us a specific location on the computer where we can save this file that we're getting here. So let me import this real quick. And one quick thing that I want to check for is if we have this location. So I'm going to say if we do files that exist, and then we're going to pass in the file storage location. So we're going to revert this. So I'm going to put an exclamation point in the beginning. So if it doesn't exist, then we're going to execute this code block. So in the if statement. So then we're going to say file storage. We're going to say file that create directories. So create directories right here. And then we're going to pass in the location. So if it doesn't exist, while we try to save the file, it's just going to go ahead and create it with this if statement. I'm keeping it on one line just so that it can look a little cleaner, but it would look like this. Okay, so if this location on the computer doesn't exist, then create the directories or create that location so that we can use it to save the file. Otherwise, if we try to save the file in the location and it doesn't exist, then that's going to give us an error. But I'm going to keep it on one line. So Control Z. Now that we have this, we can save the file. So to save the file, we can call the files again. We can say copy, and then we can get the image that get input stream. So we're going to get technically the data, and then we're going to see where to save it. So we're going to say find that resolve, and then we want to pass in the ID of the user. So we're going to say ID plus, and then we're going to pass in, we need to get the extension of the file. So let's see here. So the way that I'm going to save the file is by using the user ID. So the file name is going to be something like the UUID, like that. PNG, for example. So it's going to be the UUID of the user, that PNG. Okay, so I want something like this to be the image of the file name for the image. So we know we have the ID, so now we just need the extension of the file. Okay, so this file that we're getting here, this multi-part file, we need its extension so that we can place it here. So we'll get to that in a minute. So I'm going to put an empty string, and then I want to say replace existing, and I need another closing here, and we need to import this. So what that means is that if the image already exists, then it's gonna go ahead and replace it, and delete this here. Okay, so now we just need to pass something like that PNG here, okay, or lowercase png. So we can let's use another function. Since we are using Java 21, we can do some fancy cool stuff here. And it's also good that you guys start trying to like code your application with the newer ways of doing things in Java, like using functions and stuff like that, because Java has evolved over the last, I would say maybe the last decade. So it has evolved a lot. So it's a good idea to try to code in the new way and not use, you know, regular Java, like regular methods and stuff like that, because we can do a lot of cool things with these new features that we have in Java 21 and Java 8, from Java 8 to 21. We have a lot of cool features. So here I'm just gonna define a normal function. It's gonna take a string and it's gonna return a string. So if you see this function here, it takes a string and it returns a string. But this one, it's a by function. It takes a string and a multi-part file, and then it returns a string. So whatever is at the very end is what's going to return, and whatever is before, it's what it's going to take as parameters. As you can see, we're passing in here. So this takes a string, it returns a string. So I'm going to give it a name. So we're going to say file extension, and then we're going to pass in the value that it's going to receive. We know that it's going to receive a string. In this case, that's going to be the file name. And if it's only one parameter, then you don't need the parentheses. So I'm going to say file name and then my arrow function, just like that. And I can do something really cool here. So I can do optional of, let's say, file name, and then we can filter. We want to filter where the name, oops, I'm just gonna name this name is contains the dot. So we're gonna say name that contains, and then we want the dot, so we're gonna say dot. And then once we get that part of the name, then we can just map it to something else. So we're gonna say map, and then we're gonna map that name to let's get the name, that substring, and we would need to get the file name and then the last index of, and then we want to pass in that dot +1. So that's gonna give us the last part of the file name. And since this is an optional, we can say that, or else we can pass in something else. Then it's gonna return .png. So if it can find all of this, it's gonna just return that part of the string, which is gonna be like that part after the dot. Otherwise, it's gonna do .png as the return type of this function. And since we need the dot, we probably want to pass it in here as well. So we're gonna need the dot and then plus whatever that returns. Okay, I'm gonna try to explain again. So we want this to return an optional, right? So that's why we're wrapping it inside of an optional. That's gonna take the file name. So we have the file name in the optional, and then we're gonna filter that name. So we're gonna say we want the name to contain this dot, because we cannot work if we do not have, like, you know, something .png or .jpeg. So we need to have that dot in here. So we're checking to make sure that we have a dot. And then if we have a dot, forget about this first part for just a second. Then we're gonna take that name, we need to map it. So that means we're gonna transform it. We're gonna substring to the last index of this string +1. So the last index is gonna return the index of the string of the last occurrence of the specified substring. So we need to know what this index is, because that's what the dot is, but we need what comes after the dot. So we need the dot, whatever comes after. So we put +1. So that's gonna substring the name to whatever comes after the dot. But we know that we need the dot because we're looking for the extension. So I put dot plus in the beginning. So if this file name is myphoto.png, it's gonna say, do we have a dot? It's gonna say yes. Okay, we have the dot. So let's map it. So it's gonna say substring it to wherever the dot is +1, so that we can get the second part where this dot is. And then it's gonna give us PNG. But we know that we need the dot in the front. So I put .png. So it's gonna be .png. And if this didn't work at all, like any of this didn't work, then it's gonna say, okay, well then give them .png as a default. So now what I can do is to take that extension, and then instead of this default PNG, we're gonna pass in this and then call apply. And then we need to pass in the image that get original file name. So that's gonna give us the file name of the image, like whatever the name is, that whatever the extension is. And then now we can call this photo function instead of null that apply. And remember, this takes a string, which is the ID, and the image, which we have here. So we're gonna say ID and then file. That's gonna return a string, the third string that we're specifying here. So you really didn't have to use, I would say, maybe like fancy Java like this. But I would also not encourage you to use the old traditional way of writing Java code. So make sure you get familiar with, I would say, starting from Java 8 so that you can, you know, functions and all the cool stuff that you can do with Java. Also, this is returning a string. You can see we're not returning anything here. So that's why it's giving us this error at the bottom. So what we can do is to just return the URL that we want. So we're going to say return, and I'm going to call the servlet URI builder, component builder from current context path. So that one right here. And then we're going to say that path and then pass in what we want. So this has to point to the endpoint that we're going to have to read the image. So that's going to be contacts /image/ and then the ID plus the file extension. We can just copy this right here and then paste it here. And then scroll over a little. We need to return a string out of this. So we're going to say that to string URL. There we go. So now we're returning the string that we need to return. And I'm going to put this on a separate line. Okay. If you want to set this to a simple variable instead of calling this function multiple times, that's probably best. So let's just cut this off. And then here we're going to say string file name equal, paste that here. And then we can pass in the file name here. And we need the plus. Like that. Okay, so the file name is going to be the ID, that PNG, JPEG, whatever the extension is. So the only thing we have to do now is to define where in the computer we want to save this image. So I think I'm just going to save it in my downloads, like temporary location. So we can quickly do that. Let's define another package, constant, and then I'm going to create another class. I'm going to name it constant, and then we're just going to define public static final string, photo directory, set it equal to system. We need to navigate to the home folder of the user. So whoever is currently logged in on the computer, we're gonna get their home directory, user home. So that's how you do that in Java, or one way you can do that in Java. And then we want to go to the /downloads/uploads. So we're gonna create this folder. Even if you don't have it, even if you don't have this folder on your location, because we do this check here, it will just create it automatically if you try to save an image. So that's gonna be the photo directory. I'm gonna copy that, collapse, and pass it here. Okay, so that's the location that we're gonna be using to save all the pictures. So we're gonna pass in the location whenever we're saving the image with the file name. Okay, so we say location, resolve, and then pass in the file name, and then replace it if it already exists. So that's all we have to do for the service. Everything else is really pretty straightforward. So I would say maybe spend more time trying to understand what we're doing here and understand functional programming in Java. Like if you go inside of here, you can see this is well, not functional programming, but functional programming, but also functional interface, because they're very, very, very powerful. Like you can do some really cool stuff with this, and they're performant, and it's really clean code, and they're very easy to test, or easier to test than some traditional ways that you might want to do this. Okay, so that's everything we have to do for the service. Next, we're gonna have to expose all of this functionality over HTTP. And the way that we're going to do this is by using a controller. In this case, it's going to be a resource because this is a REST API. So let's go ahead and work on that next. So I'm going to go ahead and close everything here. Well, there's one last thing I want to mention. So inside of the service, we brought in the log, and I didn't use it at all. You can see here I didn't use it. So if you want, you can just use it by just saying log that, for example, info, and then you can say saving picture for user ID, and then you can pass in the user ID like that, ID. So there's just a dummy log, but because we have this annotation, then you can just call the log by just calling log info or error or whatever you want. Okay, so if I show you all the options, so we have info, error, and debug, some other ones. Just wanted to mention that. Okay, so let's close this off and let's go down over to the resource, resources and the properties. So I'm just going to rename this to a YAML file. I prefer to work with YAML file in this case. Also YAML, you can pass in YML or YAML. either one would work, but let's keep it to YML and refactor. And what I'm going to do is to just paste in the configuration, because this configuration is the same configuration and I just have it on my computer, and we can just walk through it. So this is the data source that I'm defining, and this is a computer on my network where the instance of the PostgreSQL server is running. So I'm just passing that in here, passing in the username, the password, and then some other stuff for JPA. So generate DDL, show SQL, hibernate DDL auto, set to update. And if you scroll down a little more, I defined some servlet multi-part stuff. So if you try to upload a file and the file is too large, by default, the servlet has a lower file size that you can upload. So I was getting the error where when I tried to upload the file, then it was saying the file was too large. So I set this configuration for that. And then some other stuff we're not really using because we don't have any exception handling, and setting up some port stuff for the server, which is the default anyway, so 8080. And then I'm setting up a path for the error to user error, and I don't even have a user error. So you can just get rid of all this stuff if you prefer, but I just leave it here so that you know you have these properties and they exist. So with this configuration in place, we should be able to run the app and it should work. Let's go ahead and run it. So I'm going to click on this green button here and enable annotation processing and just give it a second. Okay, let's see what we have, and it should be creating tables and stuff. Okay, so we're up and running on 8080. So looks like the application is working just fine. The next thing that I'm going to do is to use Postman so that we can create some users. So if we go to the resource, we're going to be testing all of these endpoints. So we're going to be, creating a new user, updating them, and just to see what we have. So that's what we're going to be working on next. So I'm going to go ahead and open Postman, and we're going to go to 8080. First, we want to go to contact. So that should give us all of the contact in the application. If we send a GET request, let's see what we have. We should have something back, but with no content. Okay, so this is the page response that we get when we call the GET for the contacts. So on the contacts path, we call a GET request and we get the page, and we can see we have no content. So if we had any contact, they would be inside of this array that I'm highlighting here. So let's duplicate this tab and let's send a post request this time to the same path, and we want to pass in a body, which is going to be JSON. Make this a little bigger. So we're going to pass in our JSON in here. So first we need to pass in a name. Just going to pass in my name. And then we're going to need a few more. So I'm just going to copy this. We're going to paste it a few times. So we need an email. Just gonna pass in an email. We need an address, and we also need, let's see what we need. I don't remember everything that we have in a contact. So we have a name, email, we need a title, font, and status, and a photo URL. So let's go back, and so we have the name, we have the email, we have the address. So let's pass in the title, and then I'm gonna say developer, and here we can pass in the status. I'm gonna say active. This is a string, so it can be whatever you want it to be. So the name, email, we have the address, the title, and then we have the status. So I'm not passing in the image URL because this is not how we set an image for the user. And I'm also not passing in any ID. The ID should be created on the fly. So whenever we send the request, the ID will be generated and then it will be saved in the database. So if we send this now, we should be able to save in a contact. Okay, so I got a 500 error. Let's go back to the backend and see what we have. So let's go back here, open the run, scroll up and scroll to the bottom. So it's telling me that there was an illegal character when we're passing in the header. So I think the user was saved, I would say, but I'm not sure. So let's go back here and let's remove this. I'm just gonna say user ID. Let's put it in curly braces and see if curly braces is acceptable. So user ID like that, and then I'm gonna just rerun. In the meantime, let's go back to Postman and let's see if the user was saved at all. So let's scroll. Well, we have to wait for the application to be back up. Let's send it now. Let's see. Nope. Okay. So you see the user was not saved, which is expected because of this line. So if we go to the service, scroll up, this line. So we will roll back if there is any kind of exception. So that's why I put the parent of all exception in there, which is the exception class. So it's going to roll back whatever transaction was going on if there is any error. Okay, so now let's see if it's going to work this time. So let's go ahead and send this request now, and it gives us the same error, illegal characters. So okay, I'm just going to get rid of the curly braces this time. So let's go back here and remove the curly braces, and then I'm going to rerun. Just going to wait for this to start. Okay, let's try to save that one user again, send, and you can see the user was saved. Now when the user is saved, you see that we have the user ID, which is the UUID. We didn't have to pass that, so you see the request, we didn't pass that, and we shouldn't, because it should be created by JPA and by default. We have everything else, and we didn't have the image or the photo URL. That's because the photo URL is null by default. And because we have this annotation, so if we go into the contact, we have the JSON include non-default, then we're not gonna show anything that has the default value. So if it's null for a string, then it's not gonna show. And if I comment this out and I rerun it, and let's go back to Postman, I also want to show you that in the response that we have when we created the first contact, if we go to headers, you'll see the location header and you can see contact/user ID. So that's what happens when you pass in the URI, when you call the create on the HTTP response. So if you go to the resource, so this URI here, it gets put in the location header. Okay, so you say this is the location of the new user that got created. So that was that. So now if we go back here and let's send this request again, we should see one user in this content. So you see we have this one user in this array, and now we have the phone, which is null, and the photo URL, which is also null. So I didn't pass in the phone. You can see it's missing the phone. So let's see if we can just copy this here and then paste it here. So for the phone, we can pass in anything that we want. Okay, and I can create a new user. John Doe. Let's use a real person. We're gonna put in Messi again. So Messi, okay, I think he lives in Miami. Well, I'm not sure, but last I heard from him, he was in Miami. And we're going to change this to soccer player. Okay, and he's active and he has a phone number. Let's save another contact. Okay, there he is. But you see now we have the photo URL, which is null. So sometimes you want this behavior. So you want to see that something is null, because in the front end, you can check for a null value and then make a decision from there, or, you know, write some logic from there. So sometimes you want this behavior, sometimes you don't want this behavior. So I'm showing you what's controlling this is this annotation right here. Okay. In my case, I'm going to keep it. But in most cases, you probably want to show everything, even if they're null, because then you can write more logic in your application. So let's rerun the backend, and we're going to go back here and then send the request again. This time we should see 2. And if we scroll down, you can see the page size, the page number, the sort. So you can see it's sorted because we sorted, and total element is 1, total pages is 1, the size is 10. So you can see with this information, we can create a pagination and then send more requests to the back, and then get different pages. So now we should be up and running. So if I send this again, now we don't have any nulls value because we have the annotation in the class, and then we have 2 of the contacts that we just created. So to show you the pagination in action, you just put a question mark, and then for example, I can say size and then pass in 1. So in this case, then what it's gonna do, it's gonna give me 1 instead of 2. So if I send this, you'll see now I get 1 contact because I say 1. So if I say 2, then it's going to give me both of them. You can see now it's giving me 2. Okay, so pagination by using the page request in the backend is already implemented by Spring, and it's very convenient. And you can see that we have all of the information about the page that we could need to create a pagination, and that's exactly what we're going to be doing. So the next thing that I want to test is the update and also the uploading of a photo. That's what we're going to be working on next. So I'm going to duplicate this tab, and let's go back to the backend one more time just so we know where we're sending this request. So let's close everything else and scroll down. So we need to send it to /contact at the class level, and then /photo so that we can upload a photo. And we need to pass in the user ID as a request parameter and also the file as the request parameter. So let's go back and do that. So we need to go to contact, and we need to go to image, and let's grab the user ID here. So scroll up, let's go here. Let's grab my ID, copy that, and then we need to pass in request param. So we're going to say body, and then we're going to say form data, and then here we're going to pass in the ID, which is the user ID. Going to paste that here, and then here we're going to pass in the file, and we need to change the type of this to be file, and then we can select the file. I'm going to select Rick Sanchez as my file, as you can see here. So if I send this request, it should be a put request to contact image. Let's double check photo, not image. So we need to send it to photo like that, and it's a put request. So that should save an image for this user. So let's send this, and you can see we have the path of the image, and you see it's, oops, I clicked on it by accident, but let's go back here. So it's localhost 8080 /contact /image, and then the user ID .png. So which means that if we send this request to the backend, which we're going to do here, it should go to this endpoint, okay? And it's going to just return all of the bytes for the image. And most browsers or most HTTP client can read bytes of an image and then render the image. Most browsers can. So let's go back here and see if Postman can do it. So we're going to send a GET request. So send, and this gives us an error. So let's see what this error is in the backend. Scroll up, and I can see that it says it couldn't find this file. Okay, so it cannot read the bytes if it cannot find the file. And I can see that I have a mistake in the path. So this should be uploads / and then the name of the file. So we need to fix that. So I'm gonna minimize this, and we can just pass in a / here, or we can put it in this upload. So here I'm gonna say / just to make it easier. And then we're gonna rerun. We're just gonna give this a second to start. Okay, so we're up and running. Let's go back to Postman and send. Okay, you can see we're getting all the bytes, but apparently Postman cannot read those bytes. So let's copy this URL, and then we're gonna open it in a browser. I'm gonna drag the browser over and then paste it. Okay, so I'm seeing the same thing again. So we're getting the data, but it's all scrambled. And I think I know what the problem is. So if we go back here and minimize this and close this. So we're returning this byte, but by default, when you have a controller set up like this by Spring Boot, it's returning JSON data. So all of these response are sent as JSON. So there's a header in the response that says, hey, this is a JSON type of response that we're sending back. And that's the default, which is very convenient because 99% of the time, you're gonna be returning JSON and not XML or any other kind of format. But we have an exception on this GET, because we're not returning JSON, we're returning an image. So to do this, what we're going to do after we specify the path, we're gonna say what kind of data this is producing. So we can call produces, and then here we need to pass in image underscore PNG underscore value. And we need to import this. It's a static, supposed to come from media type. So right here. So we're saying this is producing image type of data, not JSON. So if you go in there, you can see we have, images, JPEG, GIF, XML, and by default, it's gonna go ahead and use JSON. But in this particular case, then we're not using JSON. Or if you also want, you can pass in the image JPEG along with the GIF. So we can go here. This actually takes an array. So you can pass in an array like this, and then you can say it also return JPEG value. Well, not PNG, but I can grab the image JPEG value and then paste it here. Then make sure I import it. And you can keep passing in whatever you think that this is going to return. But I know that it's going to be image. So PNG and JPEG. We can probably pass in the GIF in case it's a GIF, but we should be okay. So now if I restart this and give it a second to start and go back to Postman, I think Postman should be able to read this. So if I send it now, you can see we get the image. Okay, because it was able to interpret it using the metadata that comes in the header. So if we go to the header, and you can see content type is image PNG. So that tells this HTTP client how to interpret the response that's coming in from the server. So that's what we had to do here. So if I do the same again in the browser, it should be able to load it. Okay, so this is my image. So now if I go back to here and I send the request, I should see my photo URL. And you notice this guy doesn't even have the photo URL property because it's null for him and we're not returning any null value. Okay, so lastly, let's add a picture for Messi. So I'm gonna copy this URL. We're gonna pass in its ID here, and then I'm gonna change this image. I'm gonna go inside of my images, and I think I have a picture of Messi here. There it is. I'm gonna select it, so messi.jpg, and then send. Okay, so here's the URL. If we click on that and send the request, here it is. Okay, and if we run this again, we should see the photo URL for Messi. Okay, so everything seems to be working fine. The only thing we have to test is the update. So all of these pictures are working and everything. Oh, we also need to check the get one so that we can see when we have one user. So let's go here. Let's duplicate this tab. And if we just pass in the ID, so contact and then the ID without any JPG, that should give us one contact. Okay, so that's Messi. So the get one contact is working. And the last one is the update. So let's change this to get contact because we're getting only one. So let's do the update. So if I send a post request to just contact, delete that, and let's open that up, go to body, raw, JSON, and we're gonna copy one of these, this entire JSON, go back here, paste it here. This time it's important that we send the user ID because when JPA sees that the ID already exists, instead of doing a create, it's going to do an update. And I'm just going to change my name here. So instead of junior RT, I'm going to say junior YouTube, and then send this. It's supposed to be a post request. You can see junior YouTube. If I scroll up, junior YouTube. And if I fetch everybody, junior YouTube. And I can also change it back to junior RT, save, back to junior RT. If I fetch everybody again, junior RT. Okay, so everything is working as expected. The only functionality that we don't have is the delete, and the delete is something that you have to implement. Should be pretty easy using JPA, but I'm just gonna leave that up to you so that you guys can do it. I also wanna show you the data in the database. So let me open my database, and then I'm just gonna do a quick select. So select star from contacts, and if I run that, you can see we have our 2 contacts already here. Okay, so Messi and myself. But if you're using MySQL or you're using any other database, I'm sure you've been checking to make sure that the data has been saving in the database. But I just wanted to show that. So I think that's pretty much everything we have to do in the backend. We have a fully working backend application. And at this point, we just have to create the front end and then have the front end talk to the backend so that we can have our full stack application working. And that's what we're going to be working on next. So I have my terminal open and I'm using git bash. And if you guys have already installed Node.js, you should be able to do node-v, and that should give you the version of Node.js that you have installed on your computer. And I have the latest version as of this recording, and that's the 20.10. So with Node.js installed, I can just do npx create-react-app. So create React app has been around for a while. There's a new way that you can spin up a front-end application, and especially React or Angular or Vue application, and that's another tool called Vite. So if you prefer, you can just use Vite. If you have Vite installed, you can just use Vite, but really it doesn't make any difference in this situation because we don't really need a specific tool to do something very specific. We just need a simple React application because this is a course for beginners. So we're not going to be doing anything fancy, even though there is some benefits for using Vite over a Create React app. But in this case, it's not going to make any difference. But just so you're aware, there's a new way to create React applications, and that is using a tool called Vite. So you can Google Vite, it will come up, and it's pretty popular right now. It's like the new kid on the block right now, but Create React app with npx should work just fine. So now I'm just gonna give the project a name. So I'm gonna call it contact app, and then I'm gonna press enter. This can take a few moments, so I'm just gonna let it finish and then I'll come back when it's over. Okay, so all the dependencies have been installed. So I'm gonna clear the screen by just pressing Ctrl L, and then I'm gonna navigate to this application. So I'm gonna say cd and then contact application. So contact app, and we're gonna go in there, and there's just 2 other packages that I need to install. So I'm gonna say npm install or npm I, and one is going to be Axios, and the other one is gonna be the React Router DOM. So I'm gonna say React Router DOM. So Axios is because we need to make HTTP requests. So it's an HTTP client that we're going to be using. It's a JavaScript HTTP client. And then React Router DOM because we need router in the React application because we're going to need to navigate to different pages. So I'm going to press enter on that and let this finish. Okay, so that was pretty fast. So I'm going to clear that. And if you want to take a quick look at what the package.json files look like, we can just cut the JSON file. So we're going to say package.json, and you can see we have all of the dependencies for React, and then we also have Axios, and we have the React DOM, and then we have React Router DOM. So for now, that's all we're gonna need. And I'm just gonna press code and a dot, and then I'm gonna say also run npm run start. So what this is gonna do, it's gonna start the application after it opens it with VS Code. Okay, so if you do code at the dot, then VS Code is going to open in this current directory. So in the home, downloads, and then the name of our app. And then after that, when I put the tool in %, it's going to run this command, which is going to start the React application. So I'm going to press enter on that. So here is the application in VS Code, and I'm going to open it up. And then I'm going to bring the browser over. And if I navigate to localhost 3000, we should be able to see our React application. So if you used Vite to create the React application, the default page is going to be different, but it shouldn't make any difference. It's still going to be a React application. So the next thing that we're going to do is to define some of the components that we're going to be using in this application. So that's what we're going to be doing next. So let's go back to the application, and I'm gonna do some cleanup here because when you create an application with Create React App, it gives you some extra files that you probably won't need. So I'm gonna go ahead and just delete this logo and also delete this web vital, also delete the setup. And then I'm gonna delete the test file because we're not dealing with any tests for this app. And then inside of the index.js, I'm gonna remove some of the imports. So remove the imports for vital. I can also remove all of this stuff at the bottom. And inside of the app.js, I'm gonna remove the logo, and I'm also gonna remove everything in here, just leaving that one div. I'm also gonna remove the class because we don't need that class in there. So I'm gonna remove it, and then I'm gonna put an h1 in there, and then I'm just gonna say hello. So let's go back to the browser, and you can see it says hello. Okay, so we cleaned everything up, and now we're ready to create the different components that we need to create. So one thing I do want to mention before we go into setting up the UI the way that we want it is that this is not a UI course. So we're not going to be going over HTML or CSS because I've already done that. So I just give you the CSS code and the UI code, but I cannot spend the time to build this HTML and CSS because that will be like even longer than almost the entire course. So what I'm going to do is to just go back to the application, and then inside of the index.css where we have the CSS for the entire application, I'm going to select everything and then paste the CSS that I have for this app. And I'm going to scroll up a little more. It's quite some lines of CSS. I don't think I'm using everything that I'm defining here because I copied the CSS from a different project that I was working on, and I just placed them here. But it shouldn't really matter because the CSS is just really for styling. So I set up everything here. You can see I define all of these variables, and then I have the resetting of all the default, and then I have some stuff for buttons and some for the header tags, and then down below I have some utility classes, so container, and then the container for the header, and then the buttons and stuff like that. So it's really just simple CSS. And even though I do know how to work with CSS and HTML, I don't really teach HTML and CSS when I'm having a course, for example, on React, because you can say that HTML and CSS, that's really React because it's a UI library, but there's a lot more in terms of core concepts I want to focus on. So I'm giving you all of the CSS code instead of spending time writing all of these CSS rules, which can really take a lot of time. So this is all the CSS that we're going to be needing for this course, and we're not going to add any more CSS. So that's all the CSS you're going to need. And I created all of this CSS. I kind of did it on the fly because I was doing it kind of fast. So we're not really following the super best practice for CSS, but it's not terrible practice either, because you can see that I define variables at the top, and then I have utility classes, and then I have resets for things that I want to reset. But maybe one day I will have a course on HTML and CSS, and we will build an entire UI application, but this is not the course for this. So I'm providing you the CSS. So that is all for the CSS. So I'm going to close this out, and then what we're going to do is to start creating the different components. So we need to have a component for the header, and then we have to represent a card, like the contact card as one component. We also need to have a contact detail and a contact list. So we're probably going to have like 4 or 5 components. So it's not really going to be a lot of components. So that's what we're going to be working on next. So inside of the source folder right here, I'm going to create another folder, and I'm just going to call it component or components, and then press enter. And then inside of this component folder, I'm going to define some components. So the first one is going to be the contact. So we're going to say contact.js, and I'm going to add another one, which is going to be the contact detail. So we're going to say contact details.js or detail. I'm going to remove the S. You can also set the extension to be JXS or JS. It should work fine either way. And we also need a component for the contact list. So I'm going to say contact list so that we can show the list of all the cards. So the main page of the application. So that's going to be the contact list component. And then lastly, we need a header. So the header component where we have the total number of contacts and the button so that we can create a new contact. So I'm going to add another one for header.js. So these are the 4 components that we're going to be needing in this course. So I'm going to close everything for now. So close all. And then I want to go to the public folder. So inside of this public folder right here, I'm going to extend this a little more. We can get rid of these logos. So let's just delete these 2 logos. You can create your own icon if you want, but for now I'm going to leave this icon, but I do want to go inside of the index.html and do some more cleanup here as well. So I'm going to remove all of the comments. Just delete those. Then I'm going to scroll up, remove all of these commits as well, and also remove that manifest.json. So I'm going to scroll up and remove all of these as well. So remove the logo and the manifest and the comments, and we can leave that metadata. It's just a description. So we will change the description to something like contact application. And I'm also going to change the title. So the title is going to be contact list. You can give the title whatever you like. And I'm also going to use a Google font that's called a popping. And I'm just going to go ahead and paste that in there. So these is because we need to connect to the Google Fonts API. So these first two, and then this third one is the actual font. So the Poppings font. And the last one is because I'm using Bootstrap icons. So I paste the CSS for Bootstrap icons. Okay. So just like CDNs that I'm passing in here so that we can have access to these resources. And the last thing that I want to talk about is this non-script. So you can see it says you need to enable JavaScript to run this app. This is not actually going to show on the UI. Unless JavaScript is not enabled, then it's going to show this line. So we can keep it here just as a safe field in case JavaScript is not enabled. Then whoever is trying to run this app can see this message, and then maybe that'll give them a clue on how to solve the problem. And I will change this icon a little later, but for now I'm just going to keep the default one, and everything else can stay. We don't really need this theme color, so I'm going to get rid of that. It's just a metadata, so you can give it any name you want and then give it any content you want, but we don't need that for now. The viewport is important because we want our application to be responsive. So this is a very, very important line. So we need to keep that line in there. But other than that, everything else looks good. So we can collapse this. We're not going to be doing anything in this public folder. All of our work is going to go inside of the source folder. So that's where we're going to put our focus. So what I'm going to be working on next is to put the code for the header, because this is a functional component in React and we really don't have any codes in any of these components. So we need to start adding the structure of what these components are going to look like, and I'm going to start with the header. So that's what we're going to be working on next. So now let's go ahead and work on this header. So one thing I do want to show you before we start is the extension that I'm using to rapidly create these structures of these components. So if I go to the extension in VS Code and scroll down a little, so this ES7 plus React Redux is the extension that's going to allow us to do this. So you can just look for this extension in VS Code and then install it on your computer. It's going to be a lifesaver. So make sure you have this extension installed. Otherwise, you're just going to have to type everything out manually, and that can actually take a lot of your time. So I'm going to close this out. And once we have this extension, we can do RAFCE, and that's a React arrow function export component. You can see it at the very end. And then I'm going to press enter, and you see what it does for me. So it gives me the function that I need for this component, which is the header. So the same name as the file, and it's also exporting it. So all of this boilerplate that I would have to type out myself, I don't have to do it. So every time we need to put the structure of a simple component, then we can just type in RAFCE, then it's going to do that for us. So I'm going to collapse this and then we're going to continue. So for the header, we need to take in two parameters. So I'm just going to destructure them as part of the argument. So the first one is going to be toggle modal, because we need to be able to open and close the modal. And the second one is the number of contact, because we need to know how many contacts that we have. So this component, which is going to be the UI for the header, where we're going to have the button to open the modal and also the number of contacts. This is called destructuring, because I know I'm going to get an object that's going to come here, which is going to be a props object. So it's going to be like this. I could do something like this, props, and then I can access prop that, and then I can pass in the name of the property that I'm looking for. So for example, I would say number of contact, and that would give me the number of contact. Instead of doing it this way, a faster way is to just destructure it from the object itself by passing in the curly braces. So we're getting the toggle modal, which in our case is going to be a function. So you can not only pass properties, but you can also pass in function. And then we're going to pass in the number of contacts so that we can show how many contacts we have in the header itself. And then in here, we're just going to return a header. So here I'm going to say header, and then I'm going to give it a class name. So we're going to say class name. This is going to be header. So this class is coming from the CSS. And then inside of here, we're going to return maybe a div. Also going to give it a class name of container, because we want everything to be inside of the container. And then inside of here, I'm going to pass in an h3. So I'm going to say h3, and we want to say contact list. And then in parentheses, we're going to pass in the number of contacts. So we're going to put 2 parentheses, and then inside of here, I need to pass in this number of contact, which is going to be like a number. So to pass anything inside of the HTML, we need to put curly braces. So I'm going to put curly braces and then put number of contact. So this is how I invoke JavaScript inside of the HTML. It's not really JavaScript, it's JSX, but that's how you invoke it inside of the HTML. You just put curly braces, and then you're going to work with your variable. And then after that, I just need to pass in a button. So we're going to say button, and this button is going to say add new contact. So that's going to be the button, and I need to give it a class name. So I'm going to say class name, that's going to be btn. And then right before the add new contact, I'm going to pass in the plus icon because I have Bootstrap icon. So I'm going to pass in an I for the icon, and then I'm going to give it a class name. So I'm going to say class name, that's going to be by space by dash plus square. And because we have the Bootstrap CSS, that's going to give us an icon. So the plus icon, which is a little square and a plus in the middle. And then now we just have to specify what's going to happen whenever they click on the button. So for this, we're going to listen to the onClick event. And then whenever they click on this button, we're going to execute some code. So error function, and then we're going to pass in the toggle modal. And the toggle modal is going to take an argument, which is going to be a Boolean, because we need to determine when we need to toggle it open or toggle it close. So in this case, I'm going to pass in true, because in this case, we want to just open it up. Hopefully this is not super confusing, and I'm just going to put these on new lines. Put the button on the new line. So the header is going to be pretty simple. It's a header. It's going to take a function to toggle the modal, so to open it or to close it. And it's going to take a number, which is going to be the number of contact. And that's going to be its structure in terms of the HTML. So it's going to be a header, and then it's going to have a div, which is going to wrap all of the content. And then it's going to have an h3. That's going to show the number of contacts, so contact list, and then the number of contacts we have. And then it's going to have a button to open the modal. The button is going to say add new contact. And then whenever we click the button, by just calling in this function that we're going to pass into this component, then it's going to open the modal because we're passing in true here. So we're toggling. If you want to implement this with like a word like open, that should also work. But I'm just going to using a Boolean true or false. So if I pass in true, that means I want it open. And if I pass in false, that means I want it closed. But in this case, we want to add in a contact, so we need to open the modal. So I pass in true here. So that's all we have to do for the header. It's a pretty simple component. So there's not much going on here. And I just typed it out because it's just a few lines of HTML. But in the future, I'm going to pass in the HTML, and then we're going to just add the functionalities that we want to add into the HTML, because typing in HTML like this is not a very good use of your time, because it's really HTML and CSS, and we want to focus on the functionalities of React. So whenever we're going to work on the other 3 components, I'm just going to give you the HTML code, and then we're going to add all of the React code on top of the HTML code, or JSX code in this case, to be more specific, if I want to be accurate. Because even though this looks like HTML, it's really a different flavor of HTML, which is called JSX. But I think at this point, everybody would be okay if you just call this HTML, because they know what it is, but we're just going to say HTML instead of JSX. All right, so now we have to work on the other ones, and that's what we're going to be working on next. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out, and I'm going to start working on the contact because it's not going to take us a lot of time. And I'm going to minimize this, and then I'm going to do RAFCE again so that I can get an error function for the component. So this is the structure of our component, and then I'm going to pass in the code for the HTML. So I'm going to paste it in. So we're going to return a link. So we can see the A here is wrapping the entire content. And then we're going to have a picture, and then the name, and then the title, and then we're going to pass in the email, the address, and then the font, and then the status. So this is going to represent the card. That's going to represent the card of the contact and the contact list page. So we're going to have a lot of these contacts being displayed in the contact list. So one piece of data we're going to need for this is the actual contact. So I'm going to pass in the contact in here. Again, destructure it from the prop, and then I'm going to scroll down a little. So the first thing that I want to change is this A here, because we need the actual link to be able to navigate us somewhere, and we need React, or the React Router DOM in this case, to take control of the navigation. So for this, we have to change this simple A to a link. So this link is supposed to come from React Router DOM. So I'm going to press enter and scroll up a little. So you can see that this link is coming from React Router DOM, and then I'm going to pass it at the bottom as well. Okay. So now we have a link coming from React Router DOM, and we can pass in a to property. So you can see here, to. So this to property is if you click on the link, where in the application that it's going to take you. So we haven't defined any routes yet, but we're going to do that in a little bit later. But whenever we click on a card, we want it to navigate us somewhere. So we want it to go to /contacts, and in / we need to pass in the ID of the particular contact that we're on. So to do this, you can see that I'm using template literal. So I'm going to pass in a $, and then open and close curly braces. And then here I can access the contact.id. So whenever we click on this particular card or HTML card, it's going to navigate us to /contacts / whatever the ID of the contact is that we're getting as a prop from this component. And then after that, we're just going to pass in the rest of the information. So here we're going to pass in open and close curly braces. We're going to pass in the contact.photo URL, and we're going to do the same for the alt, so the alternative, but we're going to pass in the name. So if for some reason the picture or the photo cannot be displayed, then if we have a screen reader, then it's going to read the name of the particular user or contact in this case. And then I'm going to scroll down a little. So for the name, again, we're not going to hard code anything. It's going to come from the contact, and then I'm going to pass in the name. So we're going to say name. And one thing I noticed when I was working on this application is if the name is very long, it's going to spill over to the card. So one thing that we can do is to substring this name so that it's not too long and spilling over and messing up our UI. So to do this, we know that the name is going to be a string. So we're going to call substring on it. So we're going to say substring, and then we're going to say from the first element, we want the first 15. So we're going to say 15. So we're just going to get the first 15 characters of the name of the user. That's what we're going to display in this paragraph right here, because we don't want the name, if it's long, to bleed over the card. And then for the title, we're going to pass in the title. And I'm going to scroll down a little more. We're going to do the same for the email. Pass in the email, and I'm going to substring the email as well. So let's just copy this line, paste it here, and I want the first 20. Okay, so if the email is very long, it's not going to take multiple lines. And then I need to get the address. So copy this one more time, paste it here, change this to address. And then we're going to do the same for the phone. So this way we're dynamically passing in the data that we want to show in the UI. So depending on whatever contact that we have, we're going to get the name and place it for the alt and the image. And then we're going to pass in the name here, the title, the email, the address. And lastly, we need to do the status. So I can come in here and then paste this again. And then I'm going to say the status. But there's one more thing I also want to do in the status. So if the status is active, I want to show a specific icon. And if the status is inactive, I want to show a different icon. So you can see how we have these icons at the beginning here. So I'm going to copy that first one, and I'm going to go here, put a space, and then paste it. So what that means is that if we were to show this in the UI, it will show the status, and then it will show the phone. Okay, so we're going to change this to show a little check mark. Otherwise, we're going to show an X, which means that the contact is inactive. So maybe you guys didn't pay attention to this when I gave you the demo at the beginning of the course, but you're going to see that in action whenever we're using this component. So to do this, what I'm going to do is inside of the P, I'm going to do open and close curly braces, and then I'm going to check for the status. So I'm going to copy this status, and then I'm going to say if the status equals to active, and then I'm going to put a question mark. If that's the case, then I want to add a specific icon. So in this case, I'm going to pass in the eye icon, and then this is going to have a class name of bi, and then bi that check that circle. So if the status is active, we're going to have this icon added in front of the actual status. Otherwise, so I'm going to put colon, we're going to pass in a different icon. So I'm going to copy the icon again and then paste it here. I'm going to put this on a new line. And in this case, the icon is going to be X. So it's going to be by X circle. So it's going to be a circle with an X in the middle if it's not active. But if it's active, then it's going to be the circle and then the check mark in the middle. So we're dynamically rendering a specific piece of UI depending on our condition. And you can see the power of React. And you can mix JavaScript with, end quotes, HTML. As you can see I'm doing here. So you can mix them together and then write your logic and then show different pieces of UI depending on your logic. And I think that's everything we need to do for the contact. It's a very simple component. There's not a lot that we're doing here. We're just passing in some data and then we're just showing the information. So that's all we have to do for the contact. I'm going to go ahead and close it. The next one that we're going to work on is the contact list. So that's what we're going to be working on next. We're going to do RAFCE again. So that's going to give us the skeleton, and I'm going to collapse this. And what we want to return in here is a main. So I'm going to say main And I'm also going to give it a class name. So we're going to say class name. This is going to be main. And you already know I provided all of the CSS. So if you're wondering where is this class coming from, then you can just look inside of the index.css. Then you should be able to find all of the classes that I'm using here. Let's close this and go back here. So inside of the main, we have to return a number of things. So the first thing that I want to do, I want to get some props. So in here, we're going to get the data, and that's going to be the page. So I'm going to name it data. So this data is going to have like the entire response from the backend. So the page with all of the page metadata along with the content, which is going to contain an array of all the content. So that's what this data is going to represent. And this is going to make sense a little bit later. And I also need to keep track of the current page. So I'm going to say current page, which is going to be an integer. And then I need to pass and get all contacts. And that's going to be a function so that we can call it to change pages. So now what I want to do is to check to see if we don't have any contact. So I can put curly braces, and then I need to access the data. I'm going to put a question mark for safe navigation. So only try to access the content if the data is defined. And I can do the same for the content. And then I'm going to pass in the length. So I'm going to say length because I know that this is going to be an array. So if it's 0, that means we don't have any data. So in this case, then I'm going to return a div. So I'm going to say div, and it's going to say no contact. Okay, so we're going to just return this div if this condition is true. So if we access the data, which is going to be like the entire response from calling a get request on the contacts endpoint, which is going to give us a JSON with metadata about the page, and also a content, which is going to be an array that's going to have all of the contacts that we have in the backend. And we're just checking to see if this array length, how many elements we have in this array, if it's 0, which means we don't have any elements in the array. If that's the case, then we're going to return this div, which is going to say no contact. You can put like no contacts, please add a new contact. Okay, so it's up to you. So if this is not the case, so I'm going to go down. I'm going to do the same thing again, open and close curly braces. And then I'm going to check for the length bigger than 0. So I'm going to copy this entire thing and paste it here. So I'm going to say if the length is greater than 0, that means we have at least one element. Then what I want to do is to go to the data, that content, and then I'm going to map on it. The reason that I can call the map function on this is because this is going to be an array. Okay, and I know that at this point the array has to have at least one element because I'm checking to see if it's greater than 0 or the length of the array is greater than 0. So I'm going to map on all the content, which is going to be an array that's going to contain all of our contacts. And then here I'm going to say for every one contact, I'm going to execute an arrow function. And in this case, I'm just going to return the contact. So I'm going to say contact. So that's going to be the component that we just defined. And then we're also going to pass it the contact, which is going to be the contact. Okay, so whatever contact that we're looping over, that's the one that we're passing into this component, because we know that this contact component is expecting a prop named contact. And then I'm going to give it a key, because whenever you're looping, React needs a key so that it can keep track of the element. And then this is going to be the contact.id, because we know the IDs are unique. And then I'm just going to go ahead and close this element. And we also need to import it. So I'm going to say import contact that's coming from that / contact. Okay, so this contact right here, which is the component that we define, we're passing it in here so that we can repeatedly create this contact component dynamic. But the only thing is we need to pass it inside of a list. So I'm going to take all of this code and then define a UL. So we're going to say UL. Actually, I should have done that in the beginning. So instead of this UL, we're going to pass in this code. And I'm going to give this UL a class name, contact __ list. Then I'm going to right click and then format document. So far, if we don't have any contact, so we're checking the content, then we're going to return no contact. If we do have some, then we're going to loop over them and then dynamically generate a no contact component and then passing into contact and then passing this key here to make React happy, because we're looping over an array. So this is going to give us the list of all of the cards with every contact and their information. Now, the last thing we have to do is to work on the pagination. So again, I'm going to open and close curly braces. Then I'm going to copy all of this, paste it here. So if we have contact, because if we don't have any contact, we're not going to try to show any pages. But in addition to that, we also need to check to make sure that we have more than one pages. So we're going to say end and then paste that here. And then after the data, we're going to pass in total pages is greater than 1. So if we have any contacts at all, and if we have more than 1 pages, then we're going to return some pieces of UI. I'm going to go on a new line, and then I'm going to say we're going to return a div. I'm going to give it a class name of pagination. And I'm going to remove this. So inside of this div, which is the pagination div, we need to do 2 things. So the first one is going to be a simple link. So an anchor tag, and I'm going to duplicate that. So we're going to have an anchor tag at the end and an anchor tag at the beginning, and the pagination is going to happen in the middle. So for the first one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in an onClick. So onClick. So what we want to happen whenever we click on this button is we want to go backwards. We want to get the current page, and then we'll remove 1 from the current page. So I'm going to get all contacts and then pass in the current page -1. Whenever we call all contacts, we'll be able to give it a page and a size. In this case, we're not worried too much about the size because we set a default to 10. But whenever we get all the contacts, we're going to -1 on the page so that we can go backwards. And now the other thing we have to do is to give it a class name. So I'm going to say class name. So just give it a class. And I want to check to make sure that we're not on the very first page. Because if we are on the first page and we press this button to get all of the contact, then it's going to go to page -1. And we never want to go to page -1 because we know that's going to break the application. So we can say for the class name, we're going to pass in open and close curly braces. And we're going to say if 0 equal to the current page. So we're going to say current page. So if that's the case, then we're going to pass in the class, which is disable. Otherwise, what we're going to do is to just don't pass anything. So I'm going to put empty string. And then for the value on the link, so we can say like previous page. So previous page or something like that. But in my case, I'm just going to pass in the left angle quote, which is this for HTML. So it's going to show the 2 little less than sign. And this is how you represent that in HTML. Or if you want, you can do something like you put 2 less than sign like this, but you can see that this is giving us an error. And that's exactly why we have HTML entities that we can use to represent those characters. So I'm going to pass in this laquo, like ampersand sign laquo, and then semicolon. So that's going to do this. And I'm going to just put it on the same line and paste it here. Okay. So that's going to be the previous button, like this one right here, which is going to -1. But we're only going to allow this if we're not on the page 0. Okay. Because if this is true, then we're going to disable this link so that they cannot click on it at all. And if you want to see what this disable is doing, I can just copy this name and then we can go back to the index.css and then I'll just search for it. And you can see its pointer events is none. Opacity is going to be 0.6. So we're going to make it gray a little bit. And then we're going to remove all pointer events so they won't be able to click it. There are different ways that you can achieve the same thing, but that's a pretty fast way that you can do that. Just remove all of the pointer event. So let's close that and close this. And then we're going to do the same thing on the second one. So copy everything here and then paste it here. So on click, we want to get all the contacts, but in this case, we're going to get all of the pages and then +1 because we want to go forward. So if we were on page 1, we want to go to page 2. So we're going to take the current page +1, but also if we are on the last page, then we don't want them to be able to click on this next page because they're on the last page. So what we can do is we know that we're going to get access to the last page in the data. So we can access the data total pages. So if the total pages equal the current page +1, then we're going to disable. Otherwise, we're not going to do anything. So we're going to leave empty string. And then for this, we need to pass in the ampersand and we're going to pass in raco and then semicolon. So this is the opposite of this laquo here. It's going to look like, something like this. Okay. Which means to go forward or to go to the next page. So let me Control Z on that. Okay, so that's what this is going to be doing. So that's the pagination for the previous page and the next page. So previous page is going to be here and the next page is going to be here and they're going to be represented by these HTML characters. So now we need to work on the actual pagination, which is going to happen in the middle. So let's go back in the middle and then I'm going to put open and close curly braces. So one thing I think would help with this logic that we're coding here is to take a quick look at the backend. So let me open Postman real quick. So if I send a request, and we get the 2 contacts that we have, and let me see if I can scroll down some more. So we know that we're going to have this content, which is going to be an array that's going to have all of our contacts. And then I'm going to collapse this. But also we have all of this information. So the total pages that I've been using is coming from this data. So this entire object is the data. and I was accessing these total pages. So if I go back and again in here, you can see this total pages that I'm accessing from the data. That's where it's coming from. So what we're trying to do is to be able to loop over these total pages, because we need to render for as many pages as we have. So for example, if this was 10, then we need to have from 1 to 10 as for our pages. So it's really this information, the pageable information, that we're using to create the pagination. So whenever you feel a little bit confused as to where we're getting all of this information from, then just go back here and look at this object. Then you will see that everything that we're using, they're coming from this object from Spring Data.jpg. So let's go back here. And what we want to do is to say, we need to create an array. So I'm going to put open and close brackets. And then I'm going to copy the existing total pages. So I'm going to say array, and then I'm going to pass in the data.total pages. So what this is going to do is going to try to create an array from a number. Okay, because you know, total pages is like a number. It's going to be like 5 or 10. And we need to construct some kind of array off of this number. And the way that we do this is by calling this constructor and then pass it the number that we want to have this array of elements of. So if this is 10, then we're going to have 10 elements inside of this array. So we're going to do this, and then we're going to say that keys, which is a function call. So then we will have this array with however many pages that we need. And then once we have this array, we can map over it. So with the map, you can see that I put the map outside of the bracket, because the brackets is what denote the array. Okay. And we're just creating this array by passing in this number to this array and then call the keys on it. And then we're going to map. So for every page that we're going to get from this array, and we also need to keep track of the index. So whenever you're mapping, you automatically have access to the index in addition to the elements that you're mapping over. So we know that we're mapping over pages, but I'm also going to keep track of the index. I'm not sure if we're going to use it, but we'll see. And then here we're going to say, we're going to execute some piece of code whenever we're mapping over this array that we just created here. Okay, so what we want to do is to render an element dynamically. In this case, it's going to be an A, so an anchor tag. And for the value of the anchor tag, it's going to be the page. So we're going to say page plus 1, because we know that's going to start from 0. So we don't want to show pages from 0 to 9 if we have 10 pages, but we want to show from 1 to 10. So that's why we're adding 1 to this, and we need to close this curly brace. And then for onclick, so we're going to pass in an onclick. So whenever they click this, we're going to pass in get all contacts, and then we will pass in the page that they click on. So here we're going to pass in page. So if it's page 0, page 1, page 2, whatever the page is. And then after that, we need to give this a class name. So we're going to say class name, and then set is equal to a class dynamically. I'm going to scroll over a little more. Maybe I should just put this on a new line. So put this on a new line. So for the class name, I'm going to put this down a little just so that you can see what's happening here. So for the class name, we're going to again look at the current page. If it's equal the page that they're looking at. So if it equals this page, then we're going to set it to active, because we know we need to show that the current page that they're on is active. Otherwise, we're not going to pass in any class. Okay, and we're going to delete this extra curly. And remember, since we're looping, we also need to pass in a key for React to be happy. So the key here is going to be just the page, because we know that these pages are going to be unique. And we need the curly brace here, and we need to close this on click here. Okay, and we can also check to see if we have any data. So we can say if we have any data, then we will execute this code. So we can say data and then pass in this logic. So hopefully that makes sense and it's all clear what we're doing. We're creating an array with these brackets by passing in the total pages, and then we're mapping on these pages. So we get the page and the index. And then for every page, we're going to render an anchor tag. And for this anchor tag, the text of it is going to be the page plus 1. So the page is going to start from 0 to whatever, how many pages we have. So we add 1 to it so that we don't have page from 0, for example, to 5, but from 1 to 6. And then whenever they click on this page, we're going to pass in the current page that they're clicking on so that we can load the data for this page. And we're going to check to see if the current page equals the actual page that they're clicking on. So this page right here in the loop. Then if that's the case, then we're going to set a class to active, which is going to make it highlighted so that they know that they're on page 1 or page 2. And then since we're looping, we have a map here. We pass in a key to make React happy, and that's all we're doing. So hopefully that makes sense. There's another way you can do this, but that's also another good way that you can do it. I already did it a different way in a previous project by just creating the array a different way. So instead of using brackets, you can use the array like array from, and then pass in the total pages again. It should work the same. So that's everything we have to do for the contact list. And whenever we need to use this component, we just need to give it the data, the current page, and the get all contacts, which is going to be a function. But other than that, it's really not doing much. So the next one we have to work on is the contact details. So that's the one that's going to show all of the details of the current contact that we click on. So the detail page of the contact, and that's what we're going to be working on next. So before we work on the contact detail, I think it would be better if we start using this existing component so that you can see how all of this is going to come into action. So I'm going to close everything, and we're just going to create another folder in the source. I'm just going to name it API and press enter. And inside of this folder, I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call it contact service.js. So this is going to be like a service class that we're going to use functions from to make calls to the backend API so that we can fetch data. So for this, I'm going to need to import Axios. So we're going to import Axios from Axios, and then I'm going to define the backend URL. So I'm going to say API _ URL and set this equal to a string, which is going to be HTTP : let's say localhost 8080 / contacts. So that's the default URL for our application. And then we're going to export some function. So I'm going to say export async, because these are going to be making HTTP calls. I'm going to say function, and let's call save contact. And this is going to take the contact. And what we're going to do is to just make a post request. So we're going to say return await, because this is an async function. So await the Axios call. So we're going to say Axios.post, and then we're going to pass in the API URL. So we're going to say API URL and also pass in the contact for the request body. Okay, so that's going to be the function that we're going to call whenever we need to save in the contact. We're just going to give it the contact and then call Axios to post on the /contact to send a post request. And then we can just maybe paste this a few times. So we have one to save. Then let's name this get contacts. And this is going to take the page, which by default we're going to set to 0. And then it's also going to take a size, which by default we're going to set to 10. We really didn't have to do this because the backend already has default, but we want to be able to pass these to this function for our pagination. So it makes sense that we pass this in here anyway, because we know that for our pagination, we're going to need to pass in the page and the size. So we didn't have to give default in the backend because we know that this is always going to be passing some default values, even when this function is being called and not having any parameters, then we know that it's going to use this default. But in case that someone else wanted to use our API, then it's not going to break, because if they don't pass in any default page, then we know that we're going to give them a default. So we have a fail safe on both sides. And then for get contacts, that's going to be a get request. So we're going to change the post to a get. And then I'm going to put string interpolation for this. So I'm going to select everything and then put backtick. And I'm going to put a $ open and close so that we can dynamically pass in this variable. And then I'm going to put a question mark. Then we need to pass in the page, which is going to be the page. So we're going to set it equal to a $, open and close, pass in the page dynamically, and then also the size. So we're going to say end and then pass in the size. So we're going to say size equal $, open and close curly braces, pass in the size. Okay, so we're passing in the page and the size as part of the URL as request parameters. So that's it for get contacts. And then I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to name this get contact. So if I want to get one contact, and here I need to give it the ID. So I'm going to say ID as the parameter. And in this case, we're going to need string interpolation again, pass it here. So we're going to call the URL of the API, and then we need to pass in the ID. So we're going to say $, open and close, and then ID. Okay, so we're passing it in as a path parameter. So this is a request parameter, and this is a path parameter, at least in the Spring Boot world. So that's all we have to do for get contact. And this is going to be the update contact. Also going to get the contact. We're going to send a post to the same API and then pass in the contact for the request body. And I'm going to name this one update photo. This one is going to take a form data, and we're going to pass in the form data here. And we need to go to /image. So I'm going to copy this whole thing, paste it here, and then we need to pass in /photo, not image, photo, and change this to a put request. So that's all we have to do here. So we don't really need this one. Well, we do need one to delete the contact. So I'll give you guys a hint since you guys have to do this. So to delete a contact, we can just pass in the ID, and then you can either do a path parameter. So something like this. So you would pass this like this, and then you would change this to a delete. Okay, so I did the front end for you. If you want to do it this way, because you don't have to do it this way, but at least the service to delete is kind of implemented if you want to go this route by just passing in the ID of the user as part of the URL. So with this in place, we can actually use this service and use these functions and then send requests to the backend. So now let's see if we can show something in the UI, because right now our application just says hello. So we can try to show a little bit more. So that's what we're going to be doing next. So I'm going to close this service, and then I'm going to go and close the API folder as well. I'm going to go to our component, and well, I need to go to the app.js where we're saying hello. And the first thing that I want to do is to define a way to capture our data. So here I'm going to define some state. So I'm going to say constant. We're going to have data, and then we're going to have set and data. And then we're going to set this equal to use state, which is supposed to come from React. And then by default, we're going to pass in an empty object. So that's going to be to hold the data that we're going to get from the backend. And we also need to do one for the current page. So I can just copy this, and then change this to current page, change this to set current page. Okay, and then by default we're going to set this to 0, so the current page is going to be page 0. So we have a way to capture the current page and also a way to capture the data. So now we can define a function to fetch the data from the backend and then show something here in the UI. So I'm going to go down, and then I'm going to define another function. So here I'm going to define get all contacts. And it's going to be a sync because we need to call one of these functions from the service that we just created. And it's going to take the page, which again, we can set the default to 0, and then the size, which also we can set to 10. And then for the function, what we're going to do is to just call the backend. So we're going to call one of the functions that we just defined. I'm going to scroll up a little bit. So here I'm going to do try and have a catch block. So try and then catch. For the catch, if we get any error, we're just gonna console log it for now. And inside of the try block is where we're going to execute our logic. So the first thing that I want to do is to set the current page. So we're going to set the current page to whatever the page is. So we're going to pass in page. So whenever we call this function, whatever the current page is, we want to set the current page to that page so that we can keep track of whatever the current page is. So in this case, when this component is rendered, the current page is going to be page 0, which was already the case here because we set it to 0, but that makes it more obvious that we need to keep track of this whenever we call this function, because we can call this function with different values, and it's a very convenient place to just set the current page here so that we can keep track of it. And then after that, we're just gonna await and then call the function. So get contacts, and get contacts is supposed to come from our, well, not get all contacts, get contacts. And this is supposed to come from our service. So we're gonna pass it the page and the size, and we have to make sure that we import this. So let's scroll up, and we're gonna say import, and then we're gonna say get contact, and this is supposed to come from our API /contact service. So that's where get contacts is coming from. So this function right here. Okay, and we know that this is gonna return us the data, so we can just destructure the data. So we can say const, and then we can pass in the data. So data, because we know that we're going to have a data that's going to contain the response from the request. And then once we get this data, then we can call set data and then pass in this data. And we can also console log that in case we want to see it. So we're going to say console log and then pass in the data just so that we can see it on the console. So now the only thing that we have to do is to call this function. You can see it's a little bit grayed out because it's declared and it's not being used. So we just have to use this. So let's scroll down here, and right before the return, we're going to go here, and then we're going to use effect. And for use effect, we're going to run a function that's going to run when the component is rendered. So for this, we're going to say whenever this component is rendered, we want you to run this code, which is to get all contacts. And we don't have to give it anything because it already has default values. So it takes two parameters, the page and the size, but we know that we have default values. So the page is going to be 0 and the size is going to be 10. So we don't have to pass this in here again. And we don't have any dependencies, so we're going to put empty array here. So this is only going to run once whenever this component is rendered. So with this in place, if your backend is running, if you go back to the browser, well, we have to go to the browser and open the developer tool, go to the console, and I'm going to close this. I'm going to zoom in a little more and then refresh. So I can see that the request was made because we can see all this network traffic, but I have a course error. Okay, so it says the course policy does not have access to this 300 to the backend. And I'm going to zoom in some more. You can see that we did send the request. So we send the request to localhost 8080. And then we pass in the page, which is 0, and the size, which is 10. But it's giving us a course error. And hopefully you guys are familiar with course, but it's technically saying because this application is running on localhost 3000 and the backend is running on localhost 8080, the browser is not allowing them to communicate unless the server, so the backend API, explicitly say that they're allowing this localhost 3000 to access their data. So we need to do that in the backend to say, hey, whenever 3000 localhost comes in, just let them go through because we trust them. So that's what this course error is. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to go ahead and fix this course error and then see if we can fetch our data. So that's what we're going to be working on next. So let's go back to the backend application and I'm going to minimize this. I'm going to create a new package for the configuration. So I'm going to say package. I'm going to name it config. And then inside of the config folder, I'm going to create another Java class, which is going to be course config. Press enter and then collapse. So this is going to be a configuration. So I'm going to annotate it with add configuration. And then we just need to define a bin, which is going to be a course filter bin. So in here, I'm going to say we need a bin, and that's going to be a public. It's going to be of type course filter. So the second one coming from Spring, and then we're going to name it course filter. And we're just going to do some configuration in this. So I'm going to put open and close curly braces. I'm going to put some more empty line at the bottom just so that I can scroll up. So for our configuration, we can define a new URL based configuration. So let's say URL based course configuration source, and then set it equal to a new, that's the name of the class, by the way, URL based course configuration source. And then we're going to define a course configuration. So we're going to say course configuration equal another new course configuration. Oh, this is supposed to be course configuration. And then for the course configuration, we're going to set allow origin. So we're going to say allow. I don't think I'm going to be using cookies or anything, but we can set allow credentials to be true. We can also set course configuration to set allowed origin. So this is one of the most important ones that we have to set. So set allowed origin. So let's scroll down and you can see that it takes a list of string. So I'm going to pass in an immutable list. So I'm going to say list of, and then here we can pass in our host or our UI application. So let's go back to the browser, just copy this, go back and paste that in there. And we don't need the / at the end. So we're saying if a request comes from localhost 3000, then we're going to allow it. And then I'm going to pass in some more headers, but those are like typical headers that I usually use whenever I have a course configuration in Spring Boot. So I'm just going to pass them in there and then I'm going to walk you through them. So I have pasted in the allow headers, and this takes a list of strings as well, as you can see here, but I want to make this immutable. So I'm going to say list of instead. That should work the same. Still going to return a list. So let's just copy this and then change it in all these places. Okay. So a list of origin, access control, allow origin, content type, accept authorization. And we also have the access control request method. So all of these are coming from Spring and I didn't create them. So if I go inside of the origin, you can see that's coming from HTTP headers from Spring and it's just origin, like the string origin. And that's true for like everything else here. And then I'm allowing specific HTTP methods. So get request, post request. I don't have any put, but I'm just going to keep it anyway. Put and patch, delete, and then options. Option is really important. And I don't think we need to edit by default. It's always going to allow options requests, but just to be safe, I'm just going to edit anyway. And then once we have all of this in place, we can go here and then call the URL based configuration source and then register this configuration. And we need to give it a base path. So we're going to say everything in the application. This configuration is 4 and then pass in the course configuration. Oops. We want the course configuration, so course configuration. And with that, we can return a new course filter. and it will pass in this URL based configuration. And now we just have to set these values. So let's create a constant for this. And this header name is x-requested with, and we're just going to pass it here. I don't think we need this, but I know all the headers that I usually need. So I just kind of like put them all the time because I know that I'm going to need them. So another thing we can do is to just make sure that we put this in our constant. So let's close this and go to constant and paste it down here. We can change this to public and then import it. Okay, it's already imported. All right, so that's the course configuration that we have to add in order to make this server or this backend application recognize this localhost 3000. And you can keep adding more. So if you had like an Angular application, for example, you could just say, hey, I'm also allowing 4200, which is the default for Angular application, but you would typically pass in your allowed UI application inside of this list. So now if we rerun this application, we should be good. Okay, looks like we're up and running again. So let's go back to the UI and refresh. Okay, you can see now we're getting our data, and I'm gonna open it up. You can see that's exactly what we got in Postman. So we get all of the pagination data, and then we have the content, which is an array where we have our two contacts. And then if I extend it, you can see that we have the two contacts that we have in the application. So everything is working as expected. The next thing we're going to do is to try to show some of this information on this UI here so that we can stop seeing this hello. And that's what we're going to be working on next. So let's go back to the code, and what we're going to do is to scroll down. So instead of hello, we can at least show the header because we know that we have all of the data that we need to show the header. So let's scroll down, and I'm going to get rid of this divs here. And instead, I'm going to return a fragment. So I'm going to say open and close like that. So that's a fragment. This is a shorthand actually for the fragment because we can only return one JXS in this return. But since we're going to have to return like multiple different HTML elements or JSX elements, then I'm just going to put this fragment here, which is going to say, hey, everything inside of this should be considered a child of this fragment, which is not going to add any UI in the structure of the HTML. So inside of this fragment, we're going to add the header. So here we're going to say, I want the header. So that should come from our header. Whoops. I don't know why VS Code is not helping and importing these. So the header is going to be self-closing, just like that. Let me see if it was imported. Nope, it was not imported. So let's see if we can import the header. So we're going to say, I'm going to put it before the service. So I'm going to put it right here. Import header from, we want to go to that / component and then / header. So now we have the header. So this header right here. So we know that we need to pass in two pieces of information, a function to toggle the modal, which we don't have yet, and the number of contacts. So let's copy these two properties and go back here. So we need to pass them in here like this. So for the toggle modal, I'm just gonna leave this empty for now, and we don't need the comma. And then for the number of contacts, we can pass in a hard-coded value because we just want to see this in action, but we need to have a function defined for the toggle modal. So let's go here, do a simple constant toggle modal, and then it's gonna take a parameter, which is gonna be the boolean. So we're gonna call it show, and all it's gonna do is let's say it's not gonna return anything. So I'm just gonna put open and close curly braces just so that we can use this as a function. So I'm gonna pass this in here. So now we should be able to see the header. So let's format this document. Let's go back, and you can see now we have contact list, and if I refresh it, we have 50. Okay, so this is not really how many users we have. We know we have 2, but I just wanted to show you that we pass in the props. And if we click on this, if I show you a quick demo of this, if I open this back up, so say we have like a console log in this, so console.log, and then it's gonna say I was clicked. So this is going to be clicked from the actual component, so this header component. So whenever they click this button, it's going to call this function. Okay, so let's go back. So I'm going to refresh this again and click this. I was click, and then we have our data. So what we need to do is to get the length of this content and then pass it in here so that we know how many we have in this array. So right now we have 2. So the length of the array is 2. So this property right here that exists on all arrays. So that's what we need to pass in here. So we need to go to data and then get the content, and then we can get the length, or we can get the total elements. So you can see this total elements coming from Spring pagination also tells us how many elements we have. So instead of drilling down inside of the content and then get the length property of the array, we can just use this total elements here because it's going to be the same thing. So let's go back to the application, and then for 50 hard coded, we're just going to say get the data and then get the total elements. Oops, elements. Okay, because we know that this exists on the data, total elements. So now if we go back, and now you see we have 2. So these 2 right here, that's the one being displayed. So now what I want to show is this list of these contacts so that we can show the cards in this UI. So that's what we're going to be working on next. So let's go back to our front-end application, and after the header, so right below the header, we're going to be passing in the routes. So we're going to say routes. So it's supposed to come from React Router DOM. So these routes are going to be in here, and the first route that we're going to have, so we're going to say route, and this can also be self-closing, so I don't have to close it like that. So we're going to say route. So the first one is going to go to the contacts. So we're going to say for this one, the path is going to be equal to /contacts. So whenever we go to /contacts, then it's going to return a specific element. And for the element, so we're going to say element, set that equal to open curly braces. We're going to pass in the contact list. So we're going to say contact list. And this is also a self-closing. And for some reason, VS Code is not helping with the import. So let's go up and import these things. Well, it imported the route. So let's also import the route. Okay, so that should work. And we know that for the contact list, which we also need to import. So we're gonna go from here. Let's just duplicate this and then copy this contact list. Should come from contact list. Okay, so we know that for this contact list, we need to give it the data, the current page, and the get all contacts, which is the function. So we can copy these 3 properties and go back here, and then we can place them here. So for the data, we know we already have that. So we're going to say, okay, so that's the data, and we don't need the comma. We also have the current page. So for the current page, we're going to set it equal to the current page. And we also have the get all contacts. So I'm going to delete that and scroll over. We're going to set this equal to get all contacts, which is this function right here that we can call and then paste it here. So we should have this now. If we go to /contacts, it should show us all the contact list. But I also want this to be the default. So to do this, I'm going to pass in another route. And I'm just going to say the path for this route is going to be the /, so the base. And then we want to give it an element. And for the element, we're going to set it equal to navigate. So we're going to say navigate. Coming from router DOM. So the navigate is like an element. So we're going to also self-close it. So we're going to say /close and then close the curly brace. And then inside of this, we need to pass in where this should go. So we're going to say to, and then set it equal to curly brace. And we want this to go to, let's make it go to contact. So we're going to say /contacts. So whenever they go to the path of the application, so the root of the application, then it's going to forward them or navigate them to contacts, which is going to then render this route. Okay, so that's what we're doing here. And we need the opening curly brace here. Okay, hopefully this was imported. Yep, it was imported. Okay, so now if we go to the application, we should see this contact list. So let's go back, and it's broken. So let's go ahead and refresh. Okay, still broken. So let's go back to the app to see what we did wrong. So all of this is looking good. Let's go inside of the contact list. This is also looking fine. So let's see what the error says. So it's saying that we need to add an error boundaries to my trees for error handling for this behavior. And it says use route may only be used only in the context of a router component. So I think I know how to fix this. So let's go back and let's go here. And for this, we can pass in the rest of the structure of the HTML. So I know I'm going to have a main here for my HTML. So everything's going to be wrapped inside of a main. So I'm going to put the main and then close it down here. Inside of the main, I'm also going to have a div. So I'm going to say div. So this main is going to have also a class, which is going to be main, and the div is going to have a class, which is going to be container. And then I'm going to close this div at the bottom like this and format this document. And then after that, so once I have the rest of the HTML in place, we need to wrap the entire application within the browser context. So that's what the error is. So this error right here. So it says it has to be used within the router context. So we need to wrap our entire application with the browser router. So if we go back to the application again, and we need to do this in the index.js. So now we can just wrap the entire thing with the browser router. So, well, I'm going to get rid of the React strict mode, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a second. And then in here, we can say browser router. So coming from the DOM or React router DOM, and we need to encapsulate the entire route or the entire application and within the context of the browser router. Okay, so that's what the error was complaining for. So now if we go back, we can see that our application is working as expected, and we can see the 2 cards. And if I try to go to the root, so go to the root like that and press enter, we get redirected to the contacts, because that's what we define inside of this. Okay, so if we go to the base, navigate us to contact. So that's all good and working. I think the next thing that I want to work on is the ability to add a new contact. So if we click on this button, we should see the pop-up that comes up here, like the modal, and then we should be able to add the information for a new contact and then save a new contact in the application. So that's what we're going to be working on next. So let's go back to the application, and what I want to do is to make the modal work. So whenever I click on this button, I want to see the pop-up to come up, and then I can close it, and then I want it to go away. So we need to be able to at least see this functionality before we can add in more functionality to actually save the new contact. So let's see if we can do that. So let's go back to the app, and for the modal, I'm gonna scroll down and I'm gonna paste the HTML code for the modal, and then I'm just gonna walk you through it. So for the modal, we just put a comment, so that says modal, and then I'm using the not too old HTML dialog tag or element, and then I'm just creating the modal, and then I'm passing in some class. So we have a class of modal, ID of modal, and then at the top it's gonna say the contact, and then it's gonna have an icon so that we can close it, and then we're gonna have the body, which is gonna have a form, so you can see the form here, and then we have the name, the email, the title, phone number, address, account setting, and then the profile photo. So the photo is gonna go here, and then after that we have a footer, and then the footer has 2 buttons, one to cancel and then one to save. So this is just the HTML markup for the modal, and of course all of these styles I already provided them. So if you just have this code, it will just look nice because I already styled this dialog. So that is just the dialog, and if we go back to the app, we're not gonna see any difference. Okay, so you can see there's nothing there because we haven't hooked up anything, and by default a dialog will not show in the HTML unless you invoke it and open it up. So let's go back and see how we can do this. So let's go back, open this up. So we know that we have this toggle modal, so this function right here, and we can pass it a boolean. If the boolean is true, we're gonna show the modal. If the boolean is false, then we're gonna hide the modal. So the dialog has a default function that we can call to open it up and to close it. So let's scroll up and give a reference to that so that we can access it. So at the very top, I'm gonna define a constant, and I'm gonna call it modal ref, and then set it equal to use ref. So we're gonna say use ref. So this one right here. Okay, it's a function call, so use ref. And we can give a reference to the dialog by using this modal ref. Well, that's modal, modal, like that. Okay, so now we can use this reference to get a hold of the native HTML inside of the React context, if that makes sense. So let's scroll down, and the way we do this is by going onto the HTML that you want to get the native reference from, and then you say ref, so you can see it coming up here, and then you pass in your reference. So we're gonna say modal ref. So we're referencing this modal ref to the native HTML dialog so that we can have access to it, and then we can call all of the native functions that exist on the dialog in HTML itself. So now we can go to this function, and what we're going to do is to check to see if show is true. So if show is true, we will now call the modal ref and then get current. So that's how you access the native element, by calling current. And then we know that there is a function called show modal that exists on the native element in HTML for the modal. So we're gonna call it. Otherwise, we're just gonna close it. So we're gonna say the same thing. So call the current and then close, which is a function call. So this is gonna toggle the modal natively using HTML, either to show it or to close it. So whenever we call this toggle modal, we give it true or false, and it's either gonna open the modal or close the modal. And then I'm gonna scroll down. So we have this new contact that's gonna be on the left, and then on the right, we're gonna have this icon, which I'm using to close the modal. So we can give this the on click. So whenever we click this, what do we want to happen? So when we click this, we want to call the toggle modal. So we're gonna say toggle modal, and then we're gonna pass in false. So that's gonna allow us to close the modal whenever we click on this icon, because I already styled it so it looks really nice. So we'll be able to close the modal using this. And I think I have a mistake here. So toggle with 2 G's. And let's make sure we correct that. Yep, this is misspelled. Let's go in the header and fix it everywhere. So toggle. So we're gonna toggle the modal. So toggle modal, and let's go back. Toggle modal. We're gonna show. Otherwise, we're gonna close. So now, if we go back and we click on Add New Contact, you can see now we have the modal coming up because we're using the native function in HTML to bring it up. And if I click on this icon, so this icon is this right here, this X large, which is a simple X. If I click it, I'm gonna call toggle modal with the false value. So if I click that, it's gonna close it. And I click it again, it's gonna bring it up. I click it again, it's gonna close it. We can also add the same closing behavior for the cancel, like this cancel at the bottom here. So if we go back to the application, we just copy this entire thing, scroll down on this button. We're gonna also give it the on click, toggle false. So if we go back again and refresh, okay, so click this, it's gonna come up, click cancel, it's gonna go away, come up, go away. So the toggle functionality is working as expected. And I already gave you guys all of the style to make this look nice like this. So make sure you get all the styles and add all the classes that you see, and yours will look exactly like this. So now the only thing we have to do is to make sure that we can save a new contact. So whenever we fill out this form and we click save, then we want the new contact to be saved. So that's what we're going to be working on next. So let's go back to the application and let's scroll up a little more. So we need to capture the data that's going to be passed into these inputs in the form. So all of these inputs here. So we're going to need some piece of state that we can use to capture that. So I'm going to duplicate this line by pressing Alt Shift and then the down arrow. And I'm going to set this as values. So I'm going to say values. So these are going to be the form values, and then set values. And this is going to be use state because we're trying to manage some state. And then inside of it, we're going to pass in an object. So this object is going to have all of the pieces of information that we need to have on the form. So we're going to have a name. So we're going to set it as an empty string for now, or as the default. And then I'm just going to copy this down. And we need the email. We also need the phone. We need the address. We need the title. And we need the status. Okay. So we're setting these values as empty for now because we don't know what they're going to be. So this is going to be the default values for them. And also need to keep track of the file. So we're going to say file and then set file. And by default, we're going to set it to undefined. Okay. So the file is undefined. So the file is the actual file that we have. So if I open it up again, so this file right here, whenever we select it, we also need to keep track of that separately, even though it's inside of the form. So let's go back and we're going to scroll down. Now we're going to make use of these values. So let's scroll down to the form. So this is the form. You can see the form is right here. Okay. So we need to pass in the name, email, title from the form to these values and the state. Okay, so let's scroll down again. And what we're going to do is to bind this to the value property. So we're going to say value and then set this equal to the values. So values.name, because we know that we have a name property inside of the value object. So this object right here is as a name property. So we're binding this input. So this input right here for the name, we're binding it to the name property. So whenever this input is changed, we're going to update these values to reflect that in the state. And we're also going to need the onChange. So we're going to say onChange. So whenever this input is changed, we need to call a function that's going to set the values for us. So to do this, we're going to call another function called onChange. So this onChange is the one that's listening to the change event on the input. But this onChange is going to be the one that we're going to call whenever this is fired, because this is going to listen to an event that's going to fired here, and it's going to pass in the event, which is going to contain the value. So let's define this function somewhere here. So I'm going to go here and then I'm going to say const onChange and set it equal to, it's going to take the event. So whatever the event is from the input. And what we're going to do is something real simple. We're going to say, we want you to set the values. So we're going to say set values. And then we're going to pass in all the existing values. So we're going to spread them. So we're going to say values. So whatever the user already had passed in, we're going to keep them. And then we're going to pass in the name of the event. So we're going to say event.target.name. And then pass in the actual value. So here we're going to put a colon, and then we're going to say event.target.value. Okay, so that's a pretty cool way that you can do this in one shot. You copy all the existing values. So the values coming from the state originally, from the event, you get the name of the event, and then you pass in the actual value for that particular name. And it's supposed to be an arrow like that. Okay, so whenever we change one of these inputs, it's going to automatically update the values in the value state. So this state right here, all of this is going to be updated. So we're binding the state with the form, and we're using this onChange function to do that. Okay, so that's what we're doing. And I'm just going to console log this as well, just so that you guys can see it. So I'm going to go here and then pass in these values, so that whenever we're passing something in the form, you can see the data being updated in real time. So now we can pass in this same piece of code. So this one on all of the input. So we're going to say pass it here, and here, and in here. And lastly, we're going to pass it in here. The photo is going to be a little different. So we're going to do that in a second. And then we're going to change this to status. So status, this is the address, this is the phone, and this is the title, and this is the email. Okay, so now if we go back to the application and clear this and refresh, okay, and then we open this up, and let's open this console. So as I'm typing, you can see it's being updated for every value. So if I open this up, for example, you can see we have the address empty, but the email has something and the name has something. And if I do the phone, now we have something on the phone, and so on and so forth. Okay, and let's do the title. So now we have everything for the title, and lastly the address. So this is our object because it's updating in real time. And it's also really important that you pass in the name property, so the native name property of the input, because that's how it's able to bind it whenever we do this. Okay, because we're getting the name of the event and the value. So now we have to work on the photo. So this photo right here. So that's what we're going to be working on next. So for the file, what we're going to do is to pass in again the onChange, because we need to listen to whenever there's an event, and whenever that occurs, we're going to call the set file. So we're going to call set file, and the way we get the file from the input or from the event is by calling event.target.files, which is going to give us an array, and then we just need to grab the first one. So we grab the first element in the array. So this is going to set the file for us whenever this input is changed, and then we can use the file at the top. So this file that we're defining here. So we're going to have access to the file here, and then we can use it in a function down here whenever we need to update the file of the contact. So if you want to see this in action, what I can do is I can also set the I can call another function here. By the way, you don't have only one function that you can call here. You can call as many functions as you want. So here I'm going to say console.log and then pass in the same thing. And because now we have multiple lines, I need to put this inside of curly braces. So before set file, we're going to put open, and then after everything, we're going to put close. So I'm not only passing in one function whenever this event occurs, we're going to pass in this, and also we're going to pass in this call. So we can call as many things that we want. We just separate them by a semicolon. So let's go back here and clear and refresh. Okay, so we've already seen the input in action. So now if we select the file, we're gonna select Rick, and you can see the file is here because we're logging it. Okay, so you can see the file was selected and we were able to access it. So that's how we're passing in this file as our file that we're setting here. So you can see this is coming from line 92. So if we go back to our application, you can see line 92 is right here. If you also want to see the file that we're setting at the top, so if I scroll over to the left, and so if you want to see this file that's being set, you can copy this file name and then you can pass it down instead. So we know that we're setting it here, so it should be available here. So let's paste that in. So we're just gonna log the file. So the file from our state, we're gonna log it here because we're setting it here. So let's go back to the browser and refresh. Okay, so let's open the Modal and select the file. Select Rick. So you can see now it's undefined because it happens so quickly. The log happens before the file is set. So that's why we have undefined here. But the file is set. So if we select another file, let's say Play, now you see line 92 has the old file, the Rick Sanchez, because this file was set. Okay, so I just want to prove to you that the file was actually set whenever we select the file here. Okay, so let's go back and change this back. Well, actually, I'm just gonna remove this altogether because we don't really need this, and remove the opening curly brace. Okay, so now we know that the file is being set, which means at the top, we can use this file and send it to the backend with the user ID so that we can save the file for the particular user. And that's exactly what we're gonna be doing, because whenever they submit this form, that's what we need to do. So at this point, things seems to be working for the form. Now we just need to make sure that we can save the data in the backend and then make sure that everything is working. So the form is ready. We can capture all of this data, including the image. And I'm also noticing that the image is still here. So there's a way that you can clean this, and we're gonna need to do this because whenever someone creates a new contact, we need to clear the form, and that includes also removing the image. So let's see if we can quickly do that. So let's go up, and I'm gonna duplicate this line again, and then I'm gonna name this file ref. Okay, so we have a reference to we're gonna use on the file. I'm gonna copy this and gonna scroll down. So after we set the file, we can also pass in the ref. So we're gonna say ref and then pass in the reference, so the file reference. So now we have access to the native element of the input, so we can just clear it whenever we need. So whenever we have a function that's gonna just update the information and then update the photo URL of the user, then we can call this reference. So for example, we would take this reference and let's say for here, for example, and then we'll say current, and then access the value, and then we can set it equal to like undefined or null or something like that. Okay, so that we can get rid of the image. So we don't have anything to update the contact yet or to create a contact yet. So we're not going to do it, but that's how we're going to do it because we have a reference to the native element of the input. So now the only thing we have left to do is to just go ahead and then save the new user. So create the save user function so that whenever we click on this save, we can submit the form and then save the user. Once the user is saved, we need to go ahead and save the image. So we're going to do that sequentially. So we're going to send the request to save the user first, because we need to get the user ID. If it's a new user, then they don't have an ID yet. So we have to save the user first. And then once we get the response, we're gonna take that response, get the user ID from the response, and then send another request to save the image. So that sounds like a lot, but this is gonna happen so fast that you're gonna think that it's only one thing that is happening, but it's gonna be two things that's happening. We're gonna save the user first, and then we're gonna save the image. So that's what we're gonna be working on next. So I noticed that the icon that is supposed to be on this button is not showing. So let's open the app and fix that real quick. So if we go back to the header, and yep, I have a typo here. So this is supposed to be square. So I'm going to put an S here, and that should fix the problem. So let's reload. So now you can see it. So the little icon here, like the little plus and the square. So now let's go back to the application, and we need to handle, let me close these and open the app. So we need to handle the form. So this form right here, we have to make sure that whenever the user click to save the new contact, we call a function that's going to send the data to the backend. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to just define this function. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to scroll up a little more. So we're going to say const, and I'm just going to name it handle new contact, and it's going to be on the sync function. So I'm going to say a sync, and it's going to take the event. So the event whenever the form is submitted, and then we're going to define the function. So what I want to do is to take the event. So I'm going to say event and prevent default. So what this is going to do, it's going to make sure that the default behavior of a form submission in the browser doesn't take effect, because if that happens, then it's gonna refresh our page and we have a single page application and we never want to refresh the page. So I'm just gonna put a try catch block here. So we're gonna say catch, and if there's any error, we're just gonna go ahead and log it for now. So I'm gonna say console.log, and then I'm gonna pass in the error. And for the try block, what we're going to do is to just make a call to the backend. So we're gonna say await and call the save contact. So you can see it's coming from our API, so the contact service. And then we're gonna pass in the values. So remember, we are setting everything in the form in this values, which is an object, right? So we're passing in all of these values from the form to this object. And then now, whenever we need to save the information, we're gonna create this function. So we're gonna pass in the values. So whatever values were set on the form, that's what we're gonna pass in here. Okay, so that's what we're doing. And this is gonna give us a response. So I can just say const. So you can say response and then set it equal to that. And I just wanna show you where the data is coming from. So if I log this response, I'm gonna say console log, and then I'm gonna pass in this response. So the response we're going to get from the backend, I'm just going to go ahead and just log it here. Okay, so that you can see what it looks like. So let's copy this now and scroll down. So on the form, so this form right here, whenever the form is submitted, we want to call this function. So we're going to say on submit, and then we're going to pass in the name of the function. In this case, that's just handle new content. So whenever the form is submitted, then it's going to call this function, and then we're going to execute our logic that we're defining here. Also, one important thing is to make sure that the button that you're going to click to submit the form should be of type submit. So that's really important. You can see the type here is button because I want this to be of type button, but this one is of type submit because we want this button to submit the form. So now if I go back and try to submit a new contact, we'll take a look at this response and see what it looks like. So let's go back here, open the developer tool, and zoom in a little more. So if I click to add a new contact, and I'm just gonna add Neymar at gmail.com, and then pass in some other data here, and then I'm just gonna say Brazil, and then active. So I'm not going to pass a file now because we don't have any logic to save the file, but I do want to show you the response. So if I click this, well, now it's complaining because this is required. So, okay, so you won't submit it because we have required on this form input. So I'm just going to select one thing here. So let's go to my download, and then I'm going to select play. So when I submit this, we should see the response being logged in this console. So if I click save, you can see we have the response. So the request was sent to the backend, and then we get this response coming from Axios. And whenever I extract the data, so this is the property that I'm extracting, because I know that I've been doing this and I wanted to show you where this data is coming from. So the data is like the response body that we want, or whatever you put as the response body from your backend. So whenever we get this entire object, we just destructure this data. There are situations where you want to look at the headers and, you know, the status code and some other stuff. But in our case, we're just interested in the response body, which is this data right here. So whenever I do this, so when I come here, and then instead of, you know, setting the response like this, I just say from the response, I'm going to destructure the data. So this is going to just pluck the data out of this response. So now if I copy this and paste it here, and if we go back, and I'm gonna send the same request again. So if I send this request again, so now you see we just have the data. Okay, so just the data property in its values from the response. But we can also see clearly that the functionality is working because we can see Neymar in the background. So you can see Neymar here. And if I refresh, I should see another Neymar. So you can see we have another Neymar. So we know that the functionality is working well. So let's finish it up. So if we go back now, what we want to do once we get this data, we want to send another request to save the pic, because now we have the data, which is the new contact with an ID. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, so now that I know the new contact at this point should be saved in the database and they should have an ID. So now I'm going to define a form data because we need to send that form to the backend. So then I'm going to say form data, call the constructor, and then from the form data, we need to attach the file. So I'm going to say form data, and then I want to say append. We want to append the file. So I'm going to say, I'm going to give it a name of file, and then we're going to pass in the file, and then pass in the file, that name, just to pass in the name of the file. And then after that, from the form data, I'm also going to attach the user ID. So here I'm going to say the key is going to be ID, or the property name is going to be ID, and the value is going to come from the data. So data.id, which is the ID of the new contact that we just saved in the database from here. Okay. And then once we have that information, we can just do another await and then call the backend to save the photo. So in this case, I'm going to say update photo. So you can see it's coming from our service. And then here we're going to pass in the form data. So I'm going to say form data, and we can get the response from this as well. So this is going to be just a URL whenever we get this response. So I can just destructure the data and then rename it. And the way you do this is by passing in a colon, and then you pass in the name you want. In my case, I want photo URL. So instead of having data as the name of the variable, whenever we destructure it, it would also clash with this data because we already have data defined here. I just rename it to photo URL. So if I do another console log for this, you will see that it's the URL that we get. And then after that, I can just reload everybody. So I'm going to call get all contacts again. But before I do that, I'm going to set the file to undefined. So I'm going to say undefined. So I'm resetting the file, like the file from the form. And then I'm going to access the file ref. So the reference that we put on the file, and then say current. And then we're going to set the value. I'm going to set it to null because we want to remove the file from the input. So if you remember, we set a reference to this input because we need to reset this after everything has been saved. So if you scroll back up here, so we're setting the file to null. So the file in our state, so this file right here. And then, well, we're setting it to undefined, not null. And then we're setting the value and the form property to null. So that's going to remove the image that we have selected in the input. And then I want to reset the form itself. So I can just copy all of this. Well, I need to copy the values and then scroll down, and I'm going to come down here. I'm going to say set values, and this takes an object. And then I'm going to say these are the values, and I want to format this. Okay, so we're resetting the form values itself. So I'm going to collapse this, and then we're going to reload all of the contacts. So with all of this in place, we should be able to save a new contact and then also save the picture as we're doing here. And then one last thing that I need to do is to close the modal. So we're going to call the toggle modal, which I want to do right after the photo has been saved. And then I'm going to pass in false, so that we can close it. And also, if we're passing just one argument here, we don't have to put the parentheses, so you can just leave it like this. So with all of this in place, we should be good to go. So let's go back to the browser, and I have a log here. So we have to remove it because it's logging stuff as we're typing in the form. And then I'm going to click on add new contact, and let's add Pele, and we're going to say pele@gmail.com. And then I'm going to say soccer player. I'm going to pass in a number, and I'm going to say Brazil, and then inactive. Okay, so now if I select a picture of Pele and click save, you can see Pele is added. So everything is working as expected. We were able to save the new contact and then save the picture and then reload everyone so that we can see the new contact. And you also see the photo URL that we're logging for the new contact. So for Pele, this is their photo URL. So if I copy this and open it in a new tab, you can see that's the picture of Pele. Okay, so everything is working as expected. And if I click on the form is reset. We don't have the picture anymore, and the form is back to its default values, which is just empty strings with no files. Okay, so that's what we want. So the next thing that I want to do is to make sure that whenever we click on a new contact, we can go to the contact details page. So that's what we're going to be working on next. So let's go back to the application, and what we want to do, I want to remove some of the logging. So for example, this log, I'm going to remove it because I don't want it to be logging in the console as I'm typing. And I think that's all. Also going to remove this photo URL, so I don't need to see that. Okay, and I think everything else looks good. Now let's go to the component for the contact details. So we haven't worked on this at all. So I'm going to type in RAFCE, press enter so that we can have the skeleton for this. Then I'm going to press Ctrl B to collapse the file tree. So for the contact detail, we need to get some props here. So the first one is going to be update contact, so that whenever we need to update the contact, we can call this function. And then we also need to update image. So we need to pass in a function to update the image and another one to update the contact itself. And I'm going to go back to the app, and I'm going to scroll up and leverage some of these codes. So I'm going to copy this and paste it here because we need to define the state. And let's also import this. And let's also import useState. It's coming from the same package, so we can put a comma here and then say we also want useState. Okay, so just like that. And I also need to keep track of the photo URL. So here I'm gonna say photo URL. So the name, email, phone, address, title, status, and then the photo URL of the contact. And then if we go back to the list, remember whenever we click, and you can see we're mapping to show every contact. Okay, so as you can see here, and if I go inside of this contact, you can see that for every card, whenever I click on the card, it's gonna go to /contacts and then / the ID of the contact. So we're gonna have the ID and the URL. So we need to grab this ID from the URL and then fetch the particular contact and then display the information. So the way that we're going to do this is first by going inside of the app, scroll down, and we want to go to our routes. So here we're defining all of the routes, and then I'm going to define another one. So I'm going to duplicate this line, and then I'm going to say if he goes to /contacts and then / ID, so that is a dynamic ID, then I want to load the contact details. So I'm going to say contact details, and then I'm going to scroll over, and then I'm going to remove these props, and we need to give it 2 props. So if we go back in there, remember we have to give it update contact and update image. So let's copy these 2 and then paste them here. And then we're going to say for update contact, we're going to create a function and give it the same name. So set it equal to update contact, get rid of the comma. And then we're going to do the same for update image. So we're going to call another function update image and then pass it in as the prop. Okay. So we need to define these 2 functions inside of this app.js component. So I'm going to scroll over and then scroll back up, and I'm just going to copy maybe this one and then scroll down. I'm just going to put the skeleton for just temporarily. So let's copy update contact, and we're going to say update contact. Then it's not going to take anything for now, and I just want to define the function, so we're just going to remove everything else. We just want to have a function so that we don't get an error, but we're going to work on this function. And then I'm going to duplicate this line again, put a space, and I'm going to copy the update image and then define it here. Okay, so we have these 2 functions that we're giving to the contact detail component as props, okay, so that it doesn't fail. But we're going to come back and then work on this function. So in the contact details, we need to fetch the data to get the contact. So what that means is that we need to get a hold of the ID. And the way you can do this is by saying, I want to get the ID. So we're going to destructure the ID. And then there's a React hook that is named use params. And then we're going to set it just like that. So the params will give you access to the data and the URL. And we're just pulling out the ID because that's what we name it in our routes. Okay, so you can see this ID here. That's what I'm trying to pull out right here. So whatever we name the dynamic parameter that we're expecting in the URL, then that's the name that we have to pass in here, because that's how it's going to be mapped. And it's supposed to be use params, okay? And it's supposed to come from the router, so React router. So now we can just log this. So we can say console.log and then pass in this ID, and then we can take a look. So now if we go back, and hopefully everything looks good. So photo URL is not defined. Let me refresh. Okay, so we're getting an error saying the photo URL is not defined. So let's go back to the app, and we forgot to set this to empty, and let's go back. Okay, and refresh one more time. So now if I click on messy, you can see we can load this page now, and you can see we get the ID of this particular contact. So this ID here should match this ID that we have in the URL. Okay, so you can see that they're the same. So now that we have the ID, we just need to make a call to the backend and then fetch that one user by that ID and then display the information on this page. So let's go back to the application, and we know that we're gonna set this to contact, and then we're gonna name this set contact. Okay, so that's gonna be our state, or the data that we're trying to save and manipulate. And once this component is loaded, it's gonna run from top to bottom, and then it's gonna grab the ID. And then once we get the ID, we can then make an HTTP call to the backend to set this contact. So let's go back and let's just grab everything from here and then go back and then paste it. We're gonna name this get contact, just one contact, and then we need to give it the ID. So it's gonna take the ID and then it's gonna grab the contact, and I'm gonna remove this, and then I'm gonna say you're gonna call get contact and then give it the ID. So that's gonna give us the data, or the contact in this case, and then all we have to do is to just call set contact, and then we're gonna pass in the data. So I'm gonna say data. So that's gonna set the contact for us for this particular component. And I can also log the contact just so we can see what it is. So if you wanted to rename this again, you would do something like this, like my contact. Okay, and then that's what you would pass in here, but I'm just gonna keep data for now. So we have the ID, and then we have a way to load this particular contact. Let me scroll up to make sure. Okay, so this is not imported, so we need to import it. So let's go here and say import. We want to import, get contact, and this is supposed to come from our API. So we need to go back once. Contact service, and I can see this is grayed out because it's conflicting with this name. So I'm gonna rename this to maybe like fetch contact. okay, so that this can reference the one from the service. So we're gonna fetch the contact, and once we're done, we're gonna set the contact, and then we're gonna log the information. If we get an error, we're gonna log the error. So now all we have to do is to call this function so that we can actually call it, because right now it's not being called, it's just being defined. So the way we're gonna do this again is by calling it once. So we can copy this entire thing. So the use effect hook, and we're gonna scroll down, and then we're gonna call fetch contact, and then we're gonna give it the ID. So the ID that we're passing in here is this ID that we're defining here, which we got from the URL, okay, by using use param. And then we define this function to fetch the data, and then we call this function once whenever this component is loaded. So I'm gonna format this. So now if we go back, and use effect is not defined, so we need to import use effect. So let's go ahead and import use effect. So I'm just gonna copy it, scroll up, and then paste it here. It's coming from the same package, okay, coming from the React package. And now let's go back, and you can see it's already here. Okay, so let's clear this and let's go back. So here I have the list of all of the contacts, and I'm gonna refresh, and then I'm gonna click on messy, and I can see that I got an error. So I'm gonna expand this and take a look. So it looks like I'm sending the wrong request. So the request method, that's what this 4 or 5 means. Let's go back to the app, and let's go back to the get contact. So we're making a post. This is supposed to be a get. Okay, so get contact is supposed to be a get. So now let's go back, and you can see the data is already loaded right here. Okay, so let's try that one more time. So let's go back here, refresh, and then clear. I'm gonna click on messy again. You can see messy is loading. Okay, so now we know how to load the particular user whenever we click on the card. So the only thing we have to do now is to just display the information and the UI, and that's what we're gonna be doing next. So let's go back to the application, and then I'm gonna scroll down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to return a fragment. Okay. And the first thing that I want to do is to return a link. So I'm going to go here, and then I'm going to say I want a link. So that's supposed to come from the React Router DOM. So for this link, I want to be able to say back to list so that we can go back to the homepage. And for the to property, I'm just going to say take us to a homepage. So I'm going to put a slash. And I also want to have a class name for this. So I'm going to say class name is link. And also I want to have an icon in front of the back to list. So here I'm going to say I. Well, it's supposed to be I. And let me delete this. And I want to give this a class name. It's going to be BI and then BI dash arrow dash left. Okay, so if we go back now, you can see it says back to list, and if I click it, it takes me back to the home page. Or if you want, you can just say to/contact. So if I copy this and pass it instead, okay, it should work the same way. So if I go to myself and then I click back, it takes me to the contact. So let's go back and continue. So we have the link. Now I'm gonna go down, and then I'm gonna define another div, and I'm gonna give it a class name of profile. So that's going to represent the profile. And then inside of that div, I'm going to pass in another div, and I'm going to give this a class name of profile underscore details. And inside of that, I'm going to scroll up a little more. I'm going to pass in an image. So img, I'm just going to give it a source property. So for the source, I'm going to pass in the contact.photo URL. And for the alt, I'm going to pass in backtick, and then I'm gonna say profile photo of, and then I can pass in the name of the contact. So I'm gonna say open and close curly braces with a $sign, and I'm gonna pass in contact.name. So in case we can't load this image, then it's gonna display profile photo of, and then it's gonna pass in the contact name. And then I'm gonna close this image tag, and then after that, I'm gonna pass in another div. That's going to be the metadata of the profile. So I'm going to pass in a class name. That's going to be profile underscore metadata. And then inside of this div, I'm going to have a paragraph, which is going to have the contact name. So I'm going to say contact.name and then close that off. And then I'm going to duplicate this line. And here I want to say the type of file that we're going to accept. So I'm going to say JPG, GIF, or PNG, max size of 10 MB. And then I'm going to pass in some class. So here I'm going to say class name profile underscore name, and I'm going to pass in another one here. And all these styles are already provided. So as long as you have the CSS, then all this should take effect. And then I'm going to pass muted for this one. And then lastly, I want a button. So we're going to say button So this button is the button that they're gonna click to upload the image. I'm gonna pass in the text of change photo. Then I'm gonna give it an icon. And for the icon, I want it to be the little upload. So we're gonna say class name bi-cloud-upload. So this is gonna be the profile detail. So this entire div, and then I'm gonna pass in a class name of btn for this. And then right after the profile detail, I'm gonna have another div, and that's gonna have a class name profile __ settings. And then I'm gonna say settings will go here. Okay, so let's go back and see what that looks like. So I'm going to click on myself. Well, we're getting the data, but it's not formatted properly. And we also misspelled a div tag. So let's go back and we're going to pass in div here. Okay. And also here. Let's go back and refresh. Okay. So now we're not getting the error anymore. So let's go back here and I need 2_ here. So profile details. So now if we go back, it should look better. Okay. So now it looks like this. So we're going to have a grid, and on the left, we're going to have the user photo with their name. And then on the right, we're going to have the form where they can update the information. So the next thing that I want to work on is this button. So whenever they click this button, I want to open the file explorer and then let the user select an image. And then we need to update this image. So let's go ahead and work on that next. So let's go back to the application. I'm going to put a listener for the click event on here. So I'm going to say on click. And whenever this button is clicked, I want to call a function called select image. Okay, so this function doesn't exist yet. So let's go ahead and create it. So let's scroll up here. And then right after fetch contact, I'm going to create another function, select image, and it's not going to take any parameter. And what we're going to do is we need to be able to click an input. So for the function body, I need to set equal. What we need a reference to a form. So let's scroll down. So right here inside of the fragment, I'm going to go down here and then I'm going to define a form. And for the form, I'm going to give it an inline style. So I'm going to say style, set it equal to display, and I'm going to say none. Okay, so that it doesn't show whenever we load the page. This form will not show because the display is set to none, but it will be present in the DOM. So it's going to be present in the HTML tree, but it just won't be visible to us. And then inside of it, I want to have an input. So we're going to say input. Okay, and then for the input, I want to give it a reference. Well, it's going to have a type of file first, and then I want to give it a reference because that's really important, because that's how we're going to make sure we can click it. So I'm going to say ref, and then I'm going to say input ref. Okay, so let's also define this. So the input ref, and we're going to come here and then we're going to say constant input ref, set it equal to use ref. Okay, coming from React. Okay, so that we can get a reference of that input. And if I scroll down, now we have the reference for the input. And then we're going to listen to the onChange event. So I'm going to say onChange. So whenever that happens, we're going to have an event and we want to grab the picture. So here we're going to say update photo and then pass in the event that target that files, and it's an array. We want to get the first one or the only one. So we pass in 0, and we can also give this a name of file and also give it an accept, because we only want to accept images. So here we're going to say image /star. So whenever this opens up the file explorer of the user, they will only be able to select file. Now we need to define this update photo. So let's scroll up and right below the fetch. Oops, wrong place. So right below, we can put it below the select image. We're going to define another constant, which is going to be this. This is going to be on the sync function because we're going to make a call to the backend. It's going to take the file that we're passing in from the form. And then here we're going to say, well, what this is going to do is another track hatch. So I'm going to copy all of this stuff, paste it here. And you know that we are getting the update image as a prop. So let's copy that and scroll down, and then I'm going to pass it here. Okay, so whenever we call update photo, ultimately it's going to call update image, and this takes a form data because we know we have to pass in the form data with the file and the user ID. So if we go back and let's scroll up a little more, I want to grab all of this, then go back and I want to paste it here and then format the document. So whenever we call update photo, we're going to give it a file, which we're doing here. Okay, so update photo, we give it the file. So what we're going to do is literally the same thing. So we get the file, we create a form data, we pass in the file, and then we pass in the ID of the user. In this case, we can just get the ID because the ID is defined right here. Okay, and I need a closing curly brace here. So now what we're going to do is to just call update image and then pass it the form data. Okay, and we're not gonna do this. And then I'm gonna format this one more time, and I can see that I'm getting an error here. So you can see the little red square rectangle here. So that's because we have curly braces in a place where we're not supposed to have it. So let's see if we can find it. So I have this ID, okay, this ends here, and we have this and then this. So I don't see a closing for this one, so we need to give it a closing one. There we go. Okay, so we're gonna call update photo, give it the file, create the form data, and then call update image. And update image is coming from our prop. Okay, so now for update image, which is right here, we need to give it an implementation. So we know that it's gonna take the form data. So I can copy this and paste it here. Oops, paste it here. Okay, so for that, what we want to do is to just make the call again to the backend. So we need to do this. So I'm gonna copy this. Well, I'm gonna copy the whole thing because I need the try catch block, and then I'm gonna minimize it. So for update image, I'm gonna paste it here. Then I'm gonna do some cleanup because I don't need to do any of this stuff. And I also don't need to set this form here because it's already set. So we're getting the form data. We're just gonna call update photo and then give it the form data. Okay, so that's gonna make the call to the backend. So if we go in here, you can see this is our service. It's gonna make the call to the backend to update the photo. Let's close that. And this is the prop function that we're passing in here for contact details. And contact details is gonna call this function whenever we call update photo. So it's calling update image, and update photo is gonna call whenever this onChange event occurs. Okay, and it's gonna pass in the file. And all we're doing is to attach the file to the form and pass in the user ID as well. So now the only thing we have to do is to click on this input, right? Whenever we click on this button. So we want this button to click this input, and we have a reference to it. So we can take that reference, and then whenever we select the image, so right here, we wanna call that reference and then get the current, oops, and then call the click because it exists on the input element in HTML. So we're calling the click that exists on the input. So now if we go back and refresh, so if I click this button, it should click the input that is on the form that we set to display none. So it's gonna call this. Okay, because we have a reference to this. So if I go back and click it, you can see we have the Explorer. And if I select this DevOps here, and then I can see that I get an error, and it says that it cannot destructure data. So let me refresh to see if the image was saved. You can see the image was saved because when I refresh, I got a new image. So we know that whenever we get a new image, the file URL is going to be the same. Okay, so this URL right here, it's always going to be the same. So we need to find a way to tell the browser to reload this image or refetch this image so that we can see the updated image. So one cool way we can do this is by passing in a time to the URL, because whenever the URL is changed, then it's going to force the browser to refetch the image so that we can display it here. So what we can do whenever we update the photo, we don't even need this. We're just gonna call the update image, so I can get rid of that. And what I'm gonna do is to just set the contact. So I'm gonna say set contact, and we know that we're gonna take the previous values. So we're gonna say previous. And with the previous value, what we want to do is to update the photo URL. So we're gonna get everything that we already had, and then we're gonna map it to a different object. So here I'm gonna say I want a different object like that. Okay, so again, one more time. So whenever we're setting the contact, we have access to the existing contact. So in the existing contact, we're gonna say we're gonna map it to a different object because we need to update the URL. So what I'm gonna do is to just say we want everything from the previous. So everything that we already had for the contact, just keep that same information, but we want to update the photo URL. So I'm gonna say photo URL, we're gonna set it equal to, and I'm gonna say backtick. We want to get the same photo URL and then append something to it so that we can force the browser to refetch it. So I'm gonna copy the previous, so $ open and close, the previous. So the previous value, which is the contact, we want to access the photo URL. So I'm gonna say that photo URL. And then I'm gonna put %, and then I'm gonna say updated at, and then pass in the time. Set it equal to $ open and close, and then I can say new date, so the JavaScript date, and then .get time. Okay, so every time we update the photo, we're gonna update the URL. You can also put a question mark here. So the updated time that the URL was updated. So now if we go back and it says data is not defined. So let's go back. We missed something here. So we're logging data, but we don't have any data. So I'm just gonna make this a string. So let's go back now and gonna expand this a little, refresh. Okay. So this is me. I'm gonna update my photo. I'm gonna choose ReactJS, and you can see now it changes to ReactJS because we force the browser to refetch the photo. Okay, so that is all good. The next thing that I want to work on is to put in the form on the right here so that we can show the information of the contact, and that's what we're going to be working on next. Let's go back to the application and I'm going to scroll down. So we know that this is where we're going to pass in the settings or the form for the user. And I'm just going to paste in the HTML. So it's a simple form. So you can see here, let me format this. So you can see the settings, and then I have this form. I have a div, and then I have this form, and then we just have the user information. So the name, email, phone, address, title, and then the status. We already took care of the image by using this form and using this logic. So now if we go back, we should be able to see the format. Okay, so it's just the form, nothing else has been added to it. And now all we have to do is to display the name, the email, address, phone, etc. on this form, which is going to be pretty easy because we know that we already have the contact defined. Okay, so we have this contact here. So we can just use this contact and then show the information on the form. So I'm going to expand this. So we have all of this information. We just need to show it on this form. Okay. So I'm going to come down here, and for the first input, which is hidden, that's because I want to capture the ID of the user, but I don't want to show it in the UI. Okay. So that's why I set it to hidden, but it's going to be part of the form. And for the value, I'm going to set a default value because I'm not going to be updating this value at all. And then I'm going to pass in the contact.id. So that way, whenever we send the request, we're also passing the ID of the user, because this is really important to update the user instead of creating a new user. Because if you pass in this information without the ID, the backend will think that you're trying to create a new user. So it's going to create a new user instead of updating the existing one. So it's really important that you pass in this ID here so that the backend or JPA can know that it's supposed to do an update and not a create. And then we can just copy this and then pass it in for the name. So for the name, I'm gonna pass in the name, and then I'm gonna copy this again, paste it down. So this is the email, phone, this is the address, and this is the title, and then this is the status. And then I'm gonna update this to status, update this to title, update this to address, update this to phone and email. Okay, so now if we go back, we should be able to see the details in the form. And by the way, if you have any question, I'll zoom in a little bit. This is the email that you can use to reach out to me. Just send me an email, then I should be able to help you. All right, so now we're displaying the information on the form. So the same information that we're loading, so the same information you see here, whenever we load the user by grabbing this ID and then call the backend, it's the same information that we're showing in this form. The only thing we have to do now is to make sure that whenever we click on save, we can update the contact information. And also notice that we're not seeing the ID, but it is present in the form. So if I do, if I go here and I go to the form, so this is the form, then expand this. So open the form, open the detail. You can see I have the ID. Okay, so you can see the value is here, but it's hidden, so it's not shown in the UI. But then we have everything else as text, so they show in the UI. So if we were to go back and then change this to text, then you'll be able to see the input. It's not style like the other ones, but you can see we have the ID here. So the ID is present in the form. Whenever we send the request, it's going to be part of the request, but we're not showing it in the UI, okay? Because we don't need to. All right, so let's go back and do Control Z on that. And if we go back now, you can see it looks normal. So let's go back, and now all we have to do is to pass in the information from the form to a function that we're going to call. And then the function is going to ultimately call the update contact. So we're going to need to set all of this contact information from the form whenever the form is updated in real times. And we already done this before. So we did this here. So we have this unchanged. I'm going to copy this unchanged and then go back to the detail, scroll down. I'm going to put it right here. Okay, so we have this unchanged. It's going to take the event, and instead of values, we're going to set the contact. Okay, so we're going to say, give us everything that we already have on the contact, and then whatever they updated also edit as part of this object. And instead of set values, we're gonna call set contact. Okay, so you can see it's the same because it's a form and we need to set these values so that we can call the backend with this value. So set contact, give us everything that we already have, and then add everything in additional or everything else that they're updating. And then we can do the same thing we did here. So if you scroll down, remember we just say unchange and then pass in our unchange function. So whenever this input is changed, then call the unchange. So we're gonna do the same thing in this form. So scroll down. We're not gonna do this for the ID because the ID is always gonna be the same. So we're gonna do it for the name. Gonna go here and pass it for the name, for the email, the phone, the address, and also the title, and lastly the status. So if I scroll up again, and if you want to see this in action, we can just console log it. So I'm gonna cut this data that I'm logging here and then pass in the contact. Okay, and go back and go to the console, refresh. Okay, so we fetch the data. So if I change anything here, you can see it's updating. Okay, so you can see the name is now different. Change the address, it's also updating. You can see it right here. So it's the same logic because we need to capture whenever they update this. So now the only thing left is to make sure that we can listen on a click event on this save and then just update the information. So let's go back, and that's gonna be pretty simple. So I can just copy all this, paste it down, gonna format the document, remove this log, and we can just name this on update contact. And this is going to be a sync. So we're going to say a sync. It's going to take the event, and we need to prevent default on the event. So we're going to say event.prevent default because we don't want the form to be submitted. And then all we have to do is to call the function that we get from the prod. So we're going to call update contact and pass it here. Well, actually, we can just pass it like this. Okay, so we prevent the form from submitting and reload the browser. And then we call update contact, which is defined in the app, and we still have to work on that. So it's going to call this function, which is going to do the update for us. So hopefully you can see how this is coming together. And then now I just need to pass this on the form. So whenever the form is submitted, so we're going to say on submit, we're going to call this function. Okay, so it's going to call on update contact. So now the only thing left to do is to make sure that we can update the contact from the backend by implementing this function. And that's what we're going to be working on next. So update contact is going to be pretty straightforward. It's going to take the contact. So we're going to say contact, and let's leverage the try catch block that we already have here. So let's copy all this stuff, collapse this, and we're going to paste it in here. Remove this space. I'm going to remove this because we don't have any event or anything like that. Format. Okay, so what we're going to do is we can delete everything in here, literally, and then we're going to call the save contact. So we're going to say save contact, and then we're going to pass in the contact, and we want to await this. Okay, and we can just also grab the data. I'm going to just call it data, and we can log it. So I'm just going to console log, pass in this data. If we get an error, we're going to log it as well. And then I'm going to format one more time. So update contact is going to take the contact and then call the save contact from the service. So the save contact, and because we're giving the ID and the contact, then it's going to do an update. And now that I'm thinking about it, I need to also pass in the ID here. So we're missing the ID, which is also going to be an empty string. Okay, so with all of this in place, we should be good to go. And after we update the user, we just need to call this again one more time. So we're going to call the update, and then we're also going to call the fetch contact. Okay, so we're going to await this, and that's it. So with all these changes, if we go back, if we didn't make any mistakes, we should be able to update this. So if I remove RT, now press save, you can see we get the response. Well, that's when we refetch it, and now it's just Junior. If I refresh the whole page, it's just Junior. If I put the RT back and then save, okay, and then I refresh, it's been saved. And I'm gonna change my picture, and you can see my picture has been updated. So now I can go ahead and fix everyone else. So I'm gonna fix Neymar and give it a Neymar picture, okay? And I'm also gonna go back and go to the second Neymar. I'm gonna make this LeBron, Akron. This is and then save, and then change the picture. Okay, so everything looks good. If we go back now, we should see everyone has a picture and they all look good. And you see, because Pelé is inactive, it has the little X instead of the little check mark. I think you can also change this to maybe like a red or an orange color, and then you change the check mark to a green to make it stand out a little more, but you get the idea. Now the last thing that I want to test is the pagination, because we haven't been able to test that. So let's go back to the application. Well, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have 5 contacts. So if we display maybe 2 or 1, then we're going to have multiple pages. So let's go back to the front end, and in the app, we want to change this to maybe 2. So we're going to show 2 contacts per page so that we can show multiple pages. So let's go back, and I can see that I have 3 pages, but it's making a call non-stop. Let's go back to the code, and we want to go to the contact list. And so I can see here on click, we're just calling this function, but we want to call it only when it's clicked. So we need to pass in the arrow function like this. So we're pointing to this function, not directly calling it. So now if we go back, everything should stabilize. If I refresh, now we're on page 1, and then I can go to page 2, page 3. Okay. And if you want, you can change this to maybe, for example, 3. So now if we go back, we're going to have just 2 pages. So 1, 2. Okay. And you can see when I'm on the first page, this is disabled. And when I'm on the last page, this last one is disabled, and whatever page that I'm on is gonna be active. Okay, so the pagination is working as expected. So now the only thing that I have to do is to work on the little notification, so that whenever we save a new contact or we update a contact, then we can show the little notification. So that's what we're gonna be working on next. So I'm gonna go ahead and open a new tab, and then I'm just gonna search for React Toast TFI, and then press enter. And I'm just going to click on this first link from npm.js, and I'm just going to copy this. Okay, so the install, and you can read more about this if you want, but it's a very cool library and it's pretty easy to use, and it's also very popular. You can see weekly download is over 1 million. So let's close this off, and let's go back to the application, and I'm gonna open the terminal just in VS Code itself, and I'm gonna drag this up a little more. Then I'm gonna paste this so that I can install this dependency. So just give it a second to finish. Okay, so we should be good now. So I'm gonna kill this terminal, and I'm gonna open our file tree. So I have API in here, and I'm gonna create another file. I'm just gonna name it toast service.js, and inside of here, the first thing that I want to do is to import this toast. So I'm gonna say toast, and it's gonna come from React Toastify, and close this. And then I'm gonna define a simple configuration. So I'm gonna say toast config, and then set it equal to an object. So this object is just gonna take some configuration that I'm gonna use in many different functions. So here I'm gonna pass in a position, and I'm gonna say this is toast.position.top right. So you can see all the different positions that you can place the little toast notification. I want mine to go on the top right, so feel free to change that. And then I want auto close, so I'm gonna say auto closed to be 1500, and I think hide in progress, so hide progress bar, I want to set this to false because I want to see the progress. And then I want the close on click, set this to true, and I want the pause on hover, set this to true. So if I hover it, I want it to pause. Draggable, I want this to be true in case I want to drag it. You can set whatever value you want for these. That's just mine. And in progress, I'm gonna set this to undefined. And then lastly, I want the theme to be light, and that takes a string. So this is all coming from the documentation. I just kind of read it, and then I know what to pass for these configurations. You just have to read the documentation. What are the properties that you can pass to this configuration? And then after that, I'm just gonna export another function. This is gonna be toast info, and then it's gonna take a message. So the message that I want to show for the toast. And then here we're gonna say toast.info. Oops. So toast.info, and then we're gonna give it the message, and then give it the config. So toast config. Okay. So for the info, we're gonna pass in the message with this configuration, and then we're just gonna keep doing that. So I'm gonna say copy. I want a success, a warning, and then an error. So the second one is gonna be success. Should have been the first one. And then this one is gonna be the warning. Last one is gonna be error. Okay, so it's really the same thing, but we're calling different functions. So for this one, we're gonna call the error. For this one, we're gonna call the warn. For this one, we're gonna call the success. Okay, so that we can have the proper notification. So with this toast service, we can just use it wherever we want in any component. So I'm gonna go back to the app, and whenever we get all of the contacts, we can still log it. So you feel free to remove that, but then I can call toast error coming from our toast service and then pass in the error message. So I'm gonna say error that message so that we can log it. And then I'm gonna copy this. I'm literally gonna do it on all of the catch so that if we get an error, we can just log it. Okay, and then for whenever the image is updated, and if you want, you can do it here. If you want, you can do it in the contact detail. So for example, in here, you can do it as well. So whenever we update the photo, we can just say toast success like this, and then we're gonna pass in photo updated just like that. We can do the same whenever we update the contact updated, and if we get an error, we're gonna do it here. So toast error, we're gonna pass in the error message, and whenever we fetch the contact, we're gonna log the error and also log the success just like that. Okay, so just to enhance the user experience a little bit. And then the last thing we have to do to see this in action, we have to go back to the main component of the application. In this case, that's the app.js. And then I want to go to the bottom of it, so right after the dialog box, but inside of my fragment, and I want to add this custom tag. So that's like the toast container, and then close it off. So that's how we're gonna show it, and make sure this is imported. So make sure it's coming from the right package. So now we should see, if we go here, you can see it's working, but the style is not applied. Okay, you can see that it's working. So if I click save, let me refresh. Okay, so I know that it's working. I just have to apply the style. So let's go back to the app again, and at the very top, well, I don't think I'm using this app CSS. So I can not only delete this, but also remove it from here, but instead I'm gonna just import the style that I need. So I'm gonna say React dash toast, and we want to go to / distribution, and then we want to go to React toastify.css. So we need to import React dash toastify / distribution / React toastify in uppercase.css. So now if we go back, we should see that it's working. Okay, contact retrieve. And if I close this for a moment and refresh, contact retrieve. If I save, contact updated. I see it twice, probably because I have it in multiple places. So let's scroll down. So here, if I go to the detail, so fetch contact is giving me contact retrieve. So I can just comment this out, then go back and then save, contact updated. And if I go back, I click on LeBron, save, contact updated. So this is really easy to use, and it's very simple. So there's not much going on it. So feel free to use it wherever you want. And if I go to Messi again and I change this photo to Jay-Z, you can see it says photo updated, and then the picture was updated. So let's put him back. So if we go back, so let's go back. Okay, so everything is working as expected. All the functionalities are working, and I'm gonna update Neymar. Okay, so if you have any questions, do let me know. So at this point, the application is complete. And also I do want to say that we use very, very simple ReactJS, because we're not using any libraries or anything like that. I mean, except the simple library like this toast notification and stuff like that. But React can come with a lot of different libraries, and a lot of this work that we're doing by hand, there's a lot of libraries and all the tools that you can use with React. And all of this is going to be like a breeze to do, because React is so popular. A lot of people spend a lot of time creating a lot of libraries and helper libraries to help you do like the common task that you would do. But since this is a course that is designed for beginners, I wanted you to see how React works in its bare form. And it's really important that you understand how the framework works in its simple form, because later when you're gonna build more complex application, obviously this is not sustainable. You can see that we're passing in props here. So you can imagine if we had a lot of nested components, how we would be passing props down and props down and props down, and that would be like a terrible design. There's tools that were created. There's different design implementation that we have to deal with these problems, because as your application gets complex, then it's very difficult to build it that way, and it's almost impossible to maintain, and it becomes very buggy. But as a beginner, you really need to understand how the framework works without all the fancy libraries that you can put on top of it, like Next.js, and using other UI tools like Tailwind and a bunch of other React UI libraries that would just give you pre-built components. You also have React with Redux that will help you maintain a store or the state of the application so that you don't have to keep passing props like this. So there's a lot of things that you can do with React. There's tons of libraries, there's tons of UI library, all the libraries to manage the state so you can avoid this pipe drilling, which is what this is called, like when you're passing in props from one component to a bunch of nested component. So there's a lot you can do with React, and it's super popular, but it's really important to understand that you need to work with React in its bare form, which is what I'm showing you in this course. Okay, so you need to understand how this framework works because it's very abstract. It's actually almost as abstract as Angular. People like to think that React is easier and it's less abstract, it's less complicated. Well, React is easier to get started with, but React is very abstract. Once you start building complex application and you have to work with all these libraries, otherwise it's going to be like a living hell for you if you have to do everything by hand. And there's been a bunch of libraries, like for example, Redux is a big library that you can use to manage state. And if I was using Redux, I wouldn't even define these data that I'm passing here like this, because the data will be stored in one specific location. And another thing too is to use TypeScript instead of JavaScript, because JavaScript is very prone to errors for when you're developing the application because it doesn't have any type safety. So the point that I'm making here is you need to understand React itself with no other library, just React and maybe the router, because this is such an integral part of an application. Like, it's very difficult to imagine any minimally complex application that's not going to have any routing. But you don't have to use all these fancy libraries and all these tools if you're just starting. So that's what this course is for. Understand how to create component, understand how to pass data to the components, and understand how to manage logic and the UI, and how to use just simple React to do everything that you need to do. But once you understand this, then you can start learning, the fancy cool libraries. You can start learning Redux and understanding state and all these different things that you can use with React. But it's really important that you work with just basic React, or just bare React that we're doing in this course. And this is in preparation for a more complex application that I'm going to be building. So I really didn't have any content on React, so I decided to do something very basic and show you how you can work with React. But for the type of content that I put out content that is very advanced. I don't put content that's for beginners. But I thought it would be important for me to make a course and just show just basic React, because once I start working on more complex application and using React, it's going to be so abstract that if you didn't understand the basics, then it's going to be almost impossible for you to understand what's going on and why things are working the way that they work. And there's a lot more hooks that we didn't use. We barely use any hooks at all. We only use the use state and the use ref and the use param and stuff like that. But there's like tons of hooks that you can use in React to do different things. And anyway, I hope this course was valuable to you. And if you have any questions, do let me know. You can join the Discord server so that you can just ask me questions, where I have a bunch of students there already. I have like hundreds of students in the server and they ask me questions all the time. All right, so this is our little application that we built using just simple React, and it's working perfectly. So now you're ready to go into the big complex application, because I'm going to be using both React and Angular to build applications. So whenever I'm creating new content, I might create a backend application using Spring, and then I build two UI. So I build one with React and then I can build another with Angular. I'm not sure that I'm going to do that yet. I might separate the two, but that's something that I'm going to be doing in the future. So I can create the front end with both React and Angular at the same time. So again, if you have any questions, let me know. If you want to email me, this is the email, so getraise@gmail.com. I check this email on a daily basis. And if you have other questions, you can just join the Discord and then you can just ask me your questions there. All right. And I will see you guys in the next one.